249 years ago, the whole world froze in horror when people looked up at the sky. There, among the clouds, a huge interdimensional gate suddenly opened. From it descended those who would later be called demons, creatures from other worlds whose appearance heralded darkness and doom. After their appearance, they ruthlessly declared their goal to subjugate and destroy the human race. This moment marked the beginning of the demon invasion. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the Orthodox Alliance created the Orthodox Heavenly Corps, whose task was to destroy the demons. The Alliance declared that it would be able to subjugate the demons, and 3 days later, their squad encountered the enemy in Anhui and were all killed. A year later, half of the population of the Central Plains had been wiped out. The Orthodox and unorthodox forces of Murima united to create a last line of resistance in Sichuan. The battle lasted more than half a month, but 90% of the resistance army fell, and the Central Plains was officially destroyed and defeated. Those who survived became slaves and were taken away to the demon realm. He himself was among the captives and was also taken away to the demon realm. He spent 5 years in captivity, being a person who, from birth, could not use internal energy, classified as a rare species. After numerous experiments and brainwashing, he was made part of the demon realm's army of subjugation. Over the years, he invaded other dimensions, wreaking havoc, killing and destroying without mercy. After 75 years of slavery and war, his merits were recognized, and he became a commander among the demons. 120 years after his promotion to commander, he finally learned of this. He lost 50 years searching for the conditions and means to prove it, and after 65 years of careful preparation, he began a rebellion against the demons. The time had come, and a week after the uprising began, the battlefield was littered with the corpses of both monsters and humans. Began, completely exhausted, looked wearily at the monster in front of him and realized with bitterness that the uprising had failed. Terran Carroll of the Demons slowly drew his sword from its sheath and said with a smile, "What a disappointment." He then added that Began had risked all his savings for a rebellion of this magnitude. The demon called out the name Schweitz von Grenthal. Began responded with hatred, saying he did not want to be called by that cursed name. Barely able to stand, he gritted his teeth and shouted that he wanted to be called Sa Began. Tarrant was silent for a few moments, then admitted that he really didn't understand. He had been watching people like Began all this time. Despite his meager abilities and talents, he always had a stubborn obsession with surviving no matter what. Then he said that this was his only strength. But why did he decide to act so recklessly after everything that had happened? Began sighed and replied that he was doing it because he had to try at least once, so that the next time they had to fight, he could be sure of victory. He had no choice but to fight Tarrant at least once. Tarrant smirked and said that it sounded interesting enough, but it was a foolish way of thinking. The demon suggested that Began was hoping for a second chance, but he would die here and now. Begun, gathering his last strength, declared that he would not allow himself to be killed so easily. He struck himself in the chest and painfully uttered a spell, summoning a magic circle. A pillar of light with 3 magical seals descended upon him, and the magic tore the sky apart. Tarrant, recognizing the glow, said that it was temporal regression, the power of Nezarin, an ancient evil god. Now it became clear why Began had silently endured defeat and humiliation for 200 years, all for this moment. With a smile, Began shouted for Tarrant to wait and see that next time he would prepare even more carefully and knock all the souls out of him. With determination in his voice, he promised himself that all the damned demons would perish. Tyrant smiled back and said he would wait for him eagerly, because Began was the only person he recognized. In the central plain of Murima, lightning struck one of the houses, piercing the roof. This lightning brought a boy whose time until the next demon invasion was 10 years. At the Orthodox Alliance Martial Arts Academy, at the Dragon Spring Academy. The next day, 2 men repairing the roof discussed what had happened. One said in surprise that he couldn't believe the lightning had struck out of nowhere. The other agreed and noted that it was so powerful that it destroyed the roof of the training hall. They continued their conversation, expressing their joy that only one person had been injured, the assistant instructor, an orphan who had been brought back by Dr. Jin Beck. They said that he was the one who had been struck by lightning a few days ago, and that he did not know how to use his inner energy, despite his title of martial arts instructor. One of the men noted that, according to rumors, he had not suffered any serious injuries. Another added with a smirk that it would have been better if he had died then, since his public execution was to take place today. Meanwhile, the judge announced that the duel for the position of assistant spear instructor at the Dragon Spring Academy would begin immediately. On one side of the arena was the current assistant spear instructor, Sa Bigan, and on the other, the candidate recommended for the position, the invincible divine spear, Man Sondok. The judge noted that a request had been received to test Sa Bigan's abilities, and this duel would determine who was worthy of becoming the assistant instructor. Both must fight, putting the honor and glory of the martial arts master at stake. Man Sondok, watching Bigan with a smirk, admitted that he seemed better than he had expected. He recalled hearing about the lightning that suddenly struck Bigan and thought that he had simply made up an excuse to avoid the fight. Pointing his blade at his opponent, Sondok declared that since Bigan had shown up after all, he would quickly end the fight considering his bravery. He added that Bigan could simply surrender without receiving any wounds or injuries. Bigan calmly replied that in the distant past, he had been an instructor who could not use internal energy. Unfortunately, this was his natural trait, and he was despised by others. In the end, this incompetent instructor, known as the disgrace of the academy, suffered a crushing defeat in a public duel. The instructor was expelled and forced to perform menial tasks. He went through some truly terrible days. Sondok furiously asked what kind of nonsense Bigan was talking about. Bigan replied that he had been waiting for this moment for a long time, calling his opponent a freak. Sondok exploded with rage and asked how he dared to behave so arrogantly. He said that he wanted to spare some of his pride because he was an instructor, but now it was time to pay for his foul mouth. He attacked him with lightning speed and delivered a vicious blow with his spear using a bull attack. Sondok wondered why he didn't feel the sensation he was supposed to feel. However, Bigan found himself behind his opponent and easily parried the blow, reminding him that to be effective, the target must be hit. Sondok tried to attack again, but Bigan confidently dodged. Sondok was amazed at how he could so easily avoid the demon bull spear technique, which he had been practicing for decades. He had been told that this guy was weak, but what he saw was very different from the stories. Bigan mockingly remarked that it was too slow and that no one could be taught with such skill. Sondok thought it was just luck and rushed into an attack with the fourth form of the demon bull spear, shouting, "Die!" Bigan confidently took his stance without hesitation and prepared for his strike. Sondok shouted that his unfinished spear technique could not block his technique. But Bigan, gathering powerful energy in his hand in an instant and stretching out his arm, summoned a fireball. A powerful stream of fire blazed in the sky, and the spectators froze in shock. Sondok was engulfed in flames and cried out in pain. The judge declared the duel over, and the assistant instructor, Sa Bigan, was declared the winner. He thought about how he had been captured by demons, dragged into their realm, and lived as best he could for hundreds of years. In the process, he realized an important truth. High-level magic is indistinguishable from martial arts. Bowing, he asked what they thought of his art, known as the fireball. Sondoka was doused with cold water, his clothes clinging to his body, his hair falling over his forehead, mixed with drops of water. A man approached him, carefully helped him to his feet, and escorted him to a stretcher. Bigan said it was a really good fight. Excited voices rang out around them. Everyone was trying to understand what had just happened. Someone in the crowd exclaimed incredulously, asking if it was really martial arts. Another young student, still captivated by what had happened, said he had heard rumors that it was the hit-yang finger technique. A stern-looking man cut in angrily, saying that it was all complete nonsense. He couldn't believe what was happening. The judge spoke firmly and formally, congratulating Bigan. Then, with noticeable doubt in his voice, he added that he was sure he couldn't use internal energy. He said that he was probably just lucky. A few days ago, he stumbled upon a previously unknown herb. After eating it, he suddenly felt the ability to use internal energy. Smiling happily, he added that now it was as if energy he had never had before had awakened inside him. The man shouted, indignantly asking if Bigan thought it was a joke. How dare he talk such nonsense in front of his elders? Bigan, remaining calm, replied that it was up to each person to believe it or not. But what did it matter? He asked a counter-question. Had he broken the rules of the duel? It was a fight for the position of instructor, and there were no restrictions on the use of internal energy or only stake techniques. He added that he sincerely did not understand why he was being questioned, since he had won fairly and justly. Seeing the situation escalate, the judge gently placed his hand on the angry man's shoulder and asked him to calm down. He agreed that Began had won, but Began interrupted him, apologizing for doing so, and took advantage of the opportunity. He said that since everyone was gathered here, he had an official request. He wanted to take the test to become a full instructor. After the fight, everyone looked at him with respect and curiosity. Someone quietly said that it was him, the one who had just participated in the duel. In his mind, Began thought that this was one of the many halls of the Dragon Spring Academy, created by the Orthodox Alliance for Teaching Martial Arts. This academy existed to train future masters who would become the backbone of the Alliance. Teenagers between the ages of 15 and 18, from sects and clans who were mature enough to be trained, were accepted there. The instructors were martial arts masters who had gone through a rigorous selection process. They were divided into assistants and senior instructors. However, to become a real teacher, it was not enough to simply be listed as an assistant. One had to pass tests and prove one's strength and loyalty. Later, when Began returned home, he was met by Dr. Jin Beck. He looked at him intently and immediately asked a question. He wanted to know what had happened and how Began had suddenly been able to use his inner energy. An image of Jean Beck, the master of the pavilion, came to Began's mind. He was not a combat instructor. He was a doctor, infinitely devoted to his work. Began calmly replied that, as he had already said, it was all a matter of luck. But Beck shouted that this was nonsense. His voice was full of pain when he said that from the very day he learned of his inability to use internal energy, he had tried everything to help. He knelt down and, unable to hold back his tears, confessed that he felt like a useless doctor. If it could be fixed so easily, then how could he be so insignificant? He said he knew how others hated Began because of this weakness, and how ashamed he was now to look him in the eye. He whispered a sincere apology, slumping as if the whole world had collapsed on his shoulders. Began looked at him and smiled warmly. He thought that Beck hadn't changed at all. He was like a father to him. 15 years ago, he was the one who rushed into the fire to save a dying child in a gang ambush, and the one who sacrificed himself for others that day. But now Began decided he would not let him die. He approached, gently took his hand, and told him not to blame himself. He didn't need to worry. He asked only one thing: to trust him. From now on, he would take care of everything. Later that evening, Began sat in his room. He concentrated, and a magic circle began to form in his palm. Inside, he thought that after his regression, he had lost more than 90% of his mana. Now he could only gather a quarter of a circle. It was disappointing, because it had taken him hundreds of years to reach the 8th circle. And yet he felt grateful because he still had mana. Clenching his fist, he said with determination that he had returned from hell. The history of Jianghu Marim had been changed, and the demons had not yet begun their invasion. But the key word was yet. In 10 years, the demons would begin their invasion, and when that happened, Murim would fall again. But now this time, everything would be different. He had 300 years of memories left. He knew information about the demon army, the magic they used, the artifacts and weapons they were preparing for the invasion. Began thought angrily that the most important thing was that he knew their leader and how to defeat them all. Jinbek entered the room and asked if he was there. Began nodded and replied that he was. He asked what was going on. Beck said that the academy's vice master, Cheon Seoman, was looking for him. Began asked in surprise if it was right now. He asked if Shoman had personally asked him to deliver the message. Beck sighed heavily and said he didn't mind, but he was worried about him. Perhaps it was a request for a promotion? He added that he was sure the test would be difficult. And considering that Man Songdok, the man recommended by Semyon, lost so badly, it is unlikely that Semyon still has positive feelings toward Began. He asked another question. Why did Began suddenly decide to become an official instructor? Began smiled and said that this was only the first step. He intended to change the entire situation at the academy. As he walked towards Simon, a thought crossed his mind that the Dragon Spring Academy was once recognized as one of the 3 best orthodox martial arts academies. But 2 years ago, its master, one of the 10 strongest martial arts masters, disappeared without a trace. Since then, the academy had been trying to find a replacement, but to no avail. Thus it began to lose its former glory. When Began entered the room, Seaman looked at him sternly and asked one last question. He wanted to know if Began was really serious about his request for a promotion. Began nodded slightly, smiling, and confirmed that he was absolutely serious about his intentions. He added in his mind that this man was one of the main reasons for the fall of the Dragon Spring Academy. On that fateful day, which marked the beginning of the end, the sky split open with frightening ease. Gaps called interdimensional gates began to open on all sides. Through them, previously unknown creatures, monstrous and ruthless, poured into the world of humans. They brought death and chaos, destroying everything in their path. Thus began the invasion of creatures that would later be called demons. The young students of the Dragon Spring Academy, full of courage and burning hope, rushed into battle. However, their efforts were in vain. Their swords could not pierce the flesh of the creatures, and their techniques were useless against the alien magic. On that day, hope was crushed. But things could have been different if Jian Seoman, then vice master of the academy, had not been the first to flee. If he had dared to report the threat, if he had activated the academy's system of 30 protective shields, perhaps then hundreds of lives could have been saved. In Begon's memories, the desperate cries of the students sacrificed on that fateful day still echoed. However, now everything was different, because he had returned to the past. But he would never forget his disgusting, ugly face. Begon said with deliberate politeness, sounding like a mockery, that he had come at the request of the academy's vice master. Seoman said he intended to tell him about a test, the successful completion of which would give him a chance to become a senior instructor. It would be an attack on the so-called Fortress of the Demonic Knight. Begon asked if he meant the very same group of bandits in the mountains behind the academy. Seoman nodded and confirmed that this was indeed the case, and that he would have to destroy them. This was his trial. The Fortress of Demonic Knight was the name given to the bandit camp, nestled in the old myth-shrouded sacred mountain that towered near the Dragon Spring Academy. Alarming reports of raids and destruction caused by this group began to arrive too often, and an order was given to destroy them in the interests of the peaceful inhabitants. This order was signed personally by Chung Semyon. Begon nodded indifferently in agreement and asked what the elimination of bandits had to do with the position of instructor. Seoman replied that such a task was one of the most fundamental requirements for senior instructors. After all, they are the foundation of the academy's combat power. All senior instructors are recognized as masters of martial arts. Not only have they reached a high level, but they are also officially recognized by the Order of the Orthodox. Each of them has performed great feats, from destroying demonic sects to defeating armed gangs. Begon, quite exhausted by this story, said that he understood everything. Then he asked how much time he had to complete the task. Dong, standing nearby, flashed with indignation and stepped forward sharply, exclaiming with annoyance, "How dare this youngster behave so rudely?" Seoman calmly pointed out that the task would take exactly 2 weeks. If Begon was even 1 day late, he would forever lose the opportunity to become a senior instructor. Began smirked as he turned toward the exit. He threw over his shoulder that he would be back in 3 days. When his figure disappeared behind the door, Dong exclaimed in amazement, "Does the vice master really intend to promote this insolent young man?" Seoman smiled and said there was no need to worry, because assistant instructor Sa Began would never return. Meanwhile, Begon, using gravitational acceleration techniques, was racing toward the fortress at breakneck speed. The thought that Cheon Semyon was a pathetic liar was spinning in his head. Did he really think that he didn't understand what the plan was? He knew that at this very moment, the Fortress of Demonic Knight was serving as a secret base for a new, as yet unknown organization called the Green Forest Union. Meanwhile, at the academy, Dong still couldn't believe what he had heard and asked again in surprise if Semyon was serious. Seoman calmly confirmed that the head of the Green Forest Union, Master Ak Guhom, was not just a bandit leader. He was a master of martial arts of the highest level. Even the Orthodox Alliance recognized him as a threat. In the past, he had led a powerful sect known as the Sect of Heavenly Shepherds. Everyone thought he had been killed by his own disciples, but in fact, he had survived and taken revenge on each of them. Because of the cruelty of his reprisals, even the unorthodox Muram had put a bounty on his head. Dong asked again how he knew about this, but Seoman looked at him and asked in return why he was even interested in such things. Subigan certainly made an impression today during the duel, but that was only possible because he was hiding his true skills. However, this test was a real situation, not a duel, and he was sure that the youngster would not return alive. Meanwhile, Begon, his lips pressed tightly together in concentration, allowed his body to break away from the slope and jump down gently, using a gravity spell to slow his fall. He reasoned aloud that if Guham was really as he remembered him, then the fourth circle of magic would not be enough. Then it would be simple to cast a new magic circle. After all, his knowledge had long since reached the eighth circle. Using search magic, he noticed a surge of mana coming from the rock. Touching it, he realized that there was a barrier in front of him, a dense mana barrier protecting the entrance. Unlocking the barrier and stepping forward into the cave, he confirmed that he was in the right place. No one could have imagined that such places existed in the Central Plains, hidden behind invisible veils of mana. Biggin smiled contentedly and raised his hand to the stone, muttering that he had finally found a source of power, a single crystal of special quality. Demons, these intelligent invaders from other worlds, did not simply invade. Thanks to interworld transition technology, they left behind hidden devices, keys to future conquests. However, there was one significant drawback. When passing through the interdimensional portal, the time required for living and non-living beings differed too greatly. Even the demons could not solve this problem. Ultimately, they came to this solution. In the worlds they planned to conquer, they secretly installed the equipment that would be needed in the future. This mana stone is the source of their power. It restores their mana. It is useless to the inhabitants of the Central Plains because they cannot use mana. But not for him. He reached out his hand. Until that moment, no one could use this source. But now everything has changed. A pillar of light burst forth from the depths of the crystal, shooting up into the sky. Later that evening, a small group approached the cave. One of the men spoke uncertainly, noticing that something was wrong. However, Guhom, the master of the fortress, cut him off sharply, ordering him to shut up and continue the search. He clearly felt the burst of energy and was sure that someone had violated the boundaries. He declared with a hoarse threat that people like his subordinates were incapable of understanding what was happening. Suddenly, there were loud bangs from the darkness. Biggin smiled and said that he had always known that Guhom was truly a master of the highest rank. Guhom looked at him and frowned, asking with a threatening tone in his voice who he was. Biggin replied with a confident smile that he was an instructor at the Dragonspring Academy. The men began to look at each other and whisper among themselves, asking in surprise if the academy instructor was really standing in front of them. One of them muttered incredulously, asking what he was doing there. Guhom abruptly cut off the conversation, coldly telling everyone to shut up. He stepped forward, grabbed his sword, and said that if he was telling the truth, then he was implying that he was the cause of that powerful energy explosion. Biggin smirked, tilting his head slightly, and said with icy mockery that perhaps it really was him. Without waiting for an answer, Guhom struck the air, and a stream of energy burst from his hand, causing an explosion directed straight at Biggin. He hissed through his teeth that if it was him, then he would kill him. That was why he had come here. Biggin dodged, attacked, and asked with cold irony if Guhom was really sure of his words. At that moment, he lunged forward and struck, but Guhom, gritting his teeth and tensing every muscle fiber, managed to parry the attack. However, the warriors standing behind Guhom did not possess such fortitude. With a single movement, he decapitated them all in a matter of moments. His gaze fell on the sword. He stretched out his hand, and the weapon, as if obeying its master's call, flew off the ground and rushed toward him. Biggin said that this was very convenient because he had also come here to kill Guhom. Guhom, no longer able to contain his rage, rushed forward with lightning speed. Biggin just smiled and calmly remarked that he had better concentrate if he really wanted to avenge his subordinates. Guhom was boiling with rage. He pressed even harder on his sword and asked in a breaking voice who he was. A fierce battle ensued between them. Each blow was parried with impeccable precision. Neither of them missed a single strike. Biggin slid forward and, blocking another thrust, said that he had already introduced himself. He was an instructor at the Dragonspring Academy. Guhom recoiled in shock, the thought striking his mind like lightning. He couldn't believe that this bastard wasn't seriously resisting him. In desperation, he decided to use his last resort, a divine art capable of destroying the sky itself. Releasing the core of his power, he shouted, cursing Biggin for forcing him to take this step. The man asked if he knew what kind of power it was. After the traitors threw him off the cliff, he gathered the energy of the core, dreaming of revenge. But Biggin interrupted him, smirking and asking who was even interested in this story. He didn't care about the memories of some pathetic villain. He immediately activated the freezing wave spell, followed by the astral chain. When Guhom was distracted for a second, energy chains burst out of the portals, instantly wrapping around him. Approaching Biggin calmly informed him that further resistance was futile. From the moment the chain touches the body, it begins to draw out internal energy. This spell was created specifically to defeat martial arts masters. Guhum, struggling to hold back a scream, asked where he had learned such sorcery and whether he was connected to a demonic cult. Began explained that it was not witchcraft, but magic. Although he would not have expected anything more from some stupid bandit, Guham whispered barely audibly that it was unfair to die in such a place. Began leaned closer and said that it seemed he had regrets. Through the pain, Guham replied that he did. He had not yet taken revenge on the bastards who had manipulated his subordinates when he was still serving in the sect that destroys the heavens. That was the reason he had worked with those disgusting types from the Orthodox Alliance. And that was why he had been hiding in this mountain, rebuilding his strength, all for the sake of one day taking revenge. Began interrupted his thoughts and began to applaud. He exclaimed with enthusiasm that he was so determined. With a slight smirk, he added that this was exactly how revenge should be: slow, thorough, and unrelenting. Guhum, choking with anger, asked if he was mocking him. What could he possibly know? He was just a child who had grown up in comfort. Began narrowed his eyes and asked coldly, "Comfort? Is that really what I look like?" Guham thought in horror that something was wrong here. Began was no ordinary madman. There was something frightening hidden in his gaze. Began approached, grabbed him by the head, and said that he would let him experience it too. He would let him feel the hell he had gone through over the last 200 years. In an instant, he found himself among gloomy rocks, surrounded by a heavy silence that weighed on him. He looked around in despair and whispered, choking with rage, what kind of place this was, and what this crazy bastard had done to him. At that moment, not just images flashed before his eyes, but a whole storm of memories filled with pain and despair. Each betrayal flashed before him with sharp pain, leaving behind a feeling of helplessness and bitterness. Each defeat came back to life like a fresh wound, filling his heart with bitter shame and rage. Every humiliation stood before him with frightening clarity, making him feel helpless. He couldn't take it anymore and cried out, begging for mercy, his voice trembling and breaking into a rasp. Biggin said with a cold smile that this was only the future that Guham would see in 10 years if he remained alive. Guham, trembling all over, grabbed his clothes, his eyes full of horror and despair, and begged him to kill him. His crying prevented him from speaking, the words bursting out in sobs, and he repeated over and over again that Began should kill him immediately because he would not be able to cope with what he had seen. Began took the sword in his hands and said with cold understanding that someone had to do it. When he returned to the village, he placed the sword in Guham's head in Semyon's office. Seeing this, Semyon exclaimed in shock that he couldn't believe what was happening. Began replied with icy calm that he would not have been trusted if he had brought only the sword, so he brought the enemy's head as well. He bowed and added that now it was time to discuss his new duties as senior instructor. The next day, Woon Jin, the senior instructor of fist techniques, slammed his fist on the table and exclaimed indignantly that this was nonsense. Just a few days ago, this man was the disgrace of the academy, and now he was a senior instructor. Archery instructor Yun Byuk asked Semyon if it was true that Began had attacked the Demonite fortress alone. Semyon sighed wearily and said that he had visited the old sacred mountain that morning and found the corpses of the bandits and Guham himself there, just as Began had claimed. He noted that he did not know how it had been done, but the throats of all except Guham had been cut with a single precise blow. Woonjin said that this was impossible because Guham was an assistant instructor in spearfighting techniques, and now it turned out that he had been hiding his sword skills. Saman asked coldly and sternly if they wanted to say that he was wrong, because everyone could see for themselves that he was right. The atmosphere in the hall became tense. Everyone fell silent and apologized. Semyon thought to himself that no matter how much he thought about it, it didn't make sense. Guham was a master of martial arts of the highest degree. He had seen this for himself when he met him in person to deliver an order from the Orthodox Alliance. And yet Began had destroyed him and all his subordinates in one night, which was beyond the capabilities of even a master of the highest level. He thought that Jin Beck could help him, but no, that old man wasn't that cunning. This situation would need to be examined in more detail. He asked Instructor Dunn if they could contact the Ghost Shadow Estate. It was one of Murima's largest assassin organizations, known for its willingness to carry out any task for the right price. Semin ordered them to send a request to find out everything about Began, every detail of his life. Buke asked in surprise if he was going to promote him to senior instructor. He replied coldly that he had a plan. Woonjin unfolded the letter and asked what kind of document it was. Semyon explained that it was a list of students for whom Bigan would be responsible. Woonjin laughed and said he expected nothing less. Semyon's idea was delightful. He emphasized that he intended to use his position for the benefit of all. Woonjin noted that there was a risk that Bigan would resign from his position before the ghost shadows could extract the necessary information from him. Semyon agreed that this was entirely possible given his modest experience. When asked if Bigan had seen the lists, Semyon replied that he had, having given them to him just before the meeting. When Woonjin asked about his reaction, Semyon said that he had merely smiled and accepted the lists. Meanwhile, Bigan reflected that the elders were acting exactly as he had expected. His return to this time and place was no accident. When he learned about Nailorun's method of returning to the past, he had asked himself hundreds, if not thousands of times what he should do to prepare for the invasion of the demons. The enemy was an army that had conquered countless dimensions, and even the strongest warrior had his limits. He understood that he could do a lot, but ultimately the best he could do was to assemble an army. Not weaklings who had fallen before his regression, but a truly powerful force trained in all kinds of magic and martial arts. He intended to gather the guys who were considered problematic among the freshmen, but who possessed unquestionable talent. Even though their personalities got in the way of their development or they didn't come from prestigious families, the senior instructors did not know that the two greatest heroes who had shone during the demon invasion were right in front of them. One of them was a martial arts master who had reached the level of evolution in his 20s and became Muram's last hope, leading the alliance in the war against demons. The second was a talented marksman who led a squad specializing in assassinations and patrols, and had the most demon kills to his name. Standing in front of the group of students, Bigan said loudly that he was pleased to meet them and that from today, he would be their instructor. Yesterday, the atmosphere at the Dragon Spring Academy was tense. Gok Boyuk, a first-year student in Camelia's class, violently struck his classmate. His victim was the eldest son of the one-star sword clan, Tan Lizhen. Gasping in pain, he bowed his head. Boyuk sneered contemptuously and said that their training was not yet complete, ordering his opponent to get up. Tang, wiping the blood from his broken lip, asked him to stop in a barely audible voice. Boyuk asked what was wrong with him, adding that it might seem like mockery from the outside. His voice sounded even more mocking when he said that Tan should be grateful for being shown the techniques of the Dragon Tiger clan, which could destroy mountains. Tan stubbornly objected that it was just the fencing technique of his one-star sword clan. Boyuk laughed loudly, calling Tan's clan insignificant. He asked sarcastically if Tan really wanted to continue learning such weak techniques that he couldn't even use against him. Tan clenched his fists, and Boyuk, noticing this, ordered him to stop. He suggested another duel, but Tan firmly refused. At that moment, the second son of the destructive swords clan, Yun Wookyoung, intervened in the conversation. His voice was cold and commanding as he told Boyuk to stop. Wookyoung reminded him that the exams were coming soon, and there was no point in causing unnecessary commotion. Boyuk sighed irritably, and casting a contemptuous glance at Legion, said that he was lucky. Tang quietly thanked Wookyoung, but he just looked at him silently and turned away. Soon a man entered the hall and announced that by order of the Academy's deputy director, Zhang Xiumen, they would no longer be studying in the Camellia class. Instead, they would be transferred to a new, specially formed class. After a while, their new instructor, Sa Bigan, said that from today he would be their mentor. However, there was no joy in the students' eyes. They exchanged dissatisfied glances, and Boyuk couldn't take it anymore and shouted. He complained about the sudden transfer, and now also about the fact that their instructor was someone he considered insufficiently qualified. His shout echoed through the hall. He was not going to obey such ridiculous orders. Bigan, maintaining a calm expression, remarked that his words sounded too insolent for a student talking to the chief instructor. Boyuk, boiling with rage, shouted that he did not understand what Bigan had done to get this position, but he was not going to learn from someone who still did not know how to use the internal arts. Suddenly, a dazzling flash lit up the hall. Bigan was instantly in front of Boyuk. He said that according to the rules of the Academy, Article 3, Section 5, he had the right to punish a student for inappropriate behavior. With these words, he stepped on Boyuk's foot with such force that the ground beneath him cracked, and Boyuk cried out in pain. Bigan continued with cold composure, explaining that punishment could be used for educational purposes. Enraged, Boyuk activated the Dragon Tiger technique that splits mountains and rushed to attack, shouting threats. However, Began easily dodged and said that insults and violence towards an elder were a serious violation. And using internal energy during class without permission is another violation. A series of quick blows rained down on the student, and finally Began kicked him in the legs so that he collapsed to the ground. His voice became mocking as he added that the worst part of it all was Boyok's pathetic level of martial arts. With a cold stare, he ordered him to get up, adding that he wasn't done yet. Tan watched the scene in amazement. His mind was filled with confusion. This was Gok Boyok, the best among the new students in martial arts, and he was losing so easily. Boyok staggered to his feet, but Began instantly met him with a knee to the face. Coming closer, the instructor said mockingly that this was a terrible result for the very first class. Swinging his arm, he added that perhaps the role of an instructor was to hold back tears and educate students. Boyok began to retreat, fear evident in his eyes, and Began was stopped in time by Yeon Wookyoung, who caught his arm. Wookyoung said calmly that this punishment was a little excessive for a student. Began looked at him and smiled, noting that Wookyoung had finally decided to intervene. His thoughts flashed to the future, because this guy was the future leader of the Heavenly Sword Alliance, one of those who would lead the resistance during the demon invasion. Young Wooken, a freshman in the Camellia class, and the second son of one of the most influential clans in the Central Plains. Renowned for his destroying sword technique, he had been proudly called a martial arts genius since childhood. His skill was unmatched even among the gifted students of the Dragon Spring Academy, and his talent far exceeded the capabilities of this educational institution. At the age of only 20, he achieved superform and became the youngest master of martial arts of the highest level in history. His name was among the 10 strongest masters of the Orthodox Alliance, and the future promised him a life of splendor and glory. But everything changed when they appeared. In the early days of the demon invasion, he did not hesitate to engage in battle and shed the blood of enemies in countless battles. However, the demonic armies soon focused their attention on the Yan clan, and the house that once shone with strength and power fell under their onslaught. Every member of the family was killed, often with a cruelty that left no doubt as to the malice of their enemies. Only Wooken survived. But unlike many others, he did not go mad with despair. Instead, the young man, immersed in the pain of loss, set out on an endless journey across the Central Plains, waging a fierce war against the demons. He gathered the survivors and united them into an alliance stronger than any orthodox or unorthodox sect. Even at the moment when all seemed lost and hope was fading, Yang Wooken led the martial arts masters in a last desperate resistance. He always fought on the front lines, and every time his sword lit up the battlefield with a dazzling light. Even huge demonic monsters that blocked the sky with their bodies fell dead in the blink of an eye. Without a doubt, in those days, he was a hero, the last hope of the world. But now in the eyes of many, he was just an arrogant, aristocratic young man from a prestigious clan. Wooken said that it was all quite amusing. Began asked what exactly amused him. That the assistant instructor, who until recently could not even control his internal energy, had suddenly become so strong. Wooken replied calmly that, of course, it was unexpected, but he didn't see anything special about it. All he could do with his newfound power was show off in front of the students. Boyk, breathing heavily and clutching his bruised body, muttered that it all looked pathetic. Wooken glanced at Began and asked if this was the result of those very encounters of fate. Began suppressed a smirk, thinking to himself that the boy was not stupid. He tilted his head and asked aloud why he was so interested. If he obediently followed his instructions, he could tell him everything. But Wooken immediately rejected the offer. He said coldly that he did not know what tricks he had used to suddenly change the student lists, but he would file an official complaint against the person responsible. He added, without turning around, that he had no intention of studying under someone who was arrogant only because of a stroke of luck. Almost all the students, without hesitation, followed him and began to leave the classroom. Began laughed and told his interlocutor to take a look at himself, then noted that he was talking as if he considered himself special. Then he asked if he thought Began couldn't teach him anything. He put his hand on Tan's shoulder, making the boy flinch, and stated calmly but defiantly that if he took on his training, in just 10 days of training, this kid would be able to defeat Wooken. The words hung in the air, causing even Tan himself to be puzzled. He, in turn, froze at these words. Wooken froze and, without turning around, asked coldly what he had just said. Began repeated clearly and distinctly that in a week, this pathetic weakling, whom he did not even consider an insect, would be able to knock him out with a single blow. Tan cried out that the instructor must have gone mad, but he didn't have time to finish because Began covered his mouth with his hand. Vukan turned and looked at him suspiciously, a flash of rage in his eyes. "Are you really ready to take responsibility for those words?" he asked slowly. Began calmly replied that of course he was, then proposed a bet and added that in 10 days they would fight each other in an official duel. Began said that if the guy won, he would follow his instructions without objection. But if his opponent won, he could do whatever he wanted with him, force him to leave the academy, order him to apologize or fall to his knees and beg, and he would fulfill his every wish. Vukan said that he didn't need anything from Began, but he would accept the challenge. He'd better prepare for the duel, which would take place in a week, and with that, he left. The class fell silent, broken only by the breathing of the excited students. Tan screamed in horror, causing Began to frown, after which Began muttered that, "Damn it, he scared him." When the boy screamed again, the instructor sighed and said he was too noisy. Tan asked in a breaking voice what his mentor had just done. Began said that his interlocutor was overflowing with energy and suggested that he calm down and let him go, promising to explain everything. The boy sobbed and demanded an answer as to why he had to fight Wukan, what he had done to deserve it, and whether the instructor had gone mad. Begun pushed his hands away and said sharply for him to let go. When he saw that Tan was trembling and crying, his voice softened, and he said that it looked like today's class was canceled. He announced that they were free to go and that the schedule for the next training sessions would be sent to each of them individually tomorrow. Tan remained where he was, trembling all over and whispering that it was the end for him, that this would be his last duel in life. Began calmly said that he just had to win and asked why he was so sure he would lose. Tan painfully recalled that during his first public duel after enrollment, he had been shamefully defeated by Gok Boyak. Since then, Boyak had tormented him every day. But even this monster Boyak couldn't land a single blow on Woken. He was completely destroyed. Began nodded and said that Yong Wuken was undoubtedly special. Even without the support of his clan, his talent was one of a kind. Tan pleaded, asking why the instructor had dragged him into this duel anyway. Began smiled, tapped him lightly on the chest with his finger, and told him not to worry because he was stronger than he thought. He remembered the first year of Camelia's class, the one-star sword clan, and Dan Liz Hun, who was known as the Divine Archer before his regression. Tang gritted his teeth and said desperately that it was fine, but they really couldn't do anything about the fact that their class and head instructor had suddenly changed. He looked up full of confusion and asked why he had to participate in a public duel with Yong Wuken. Began calmly asked with a confident look whether Tan understood the essence of what was happening and explained that victory in the duel was necessary to prove his abilities. Tan exclaimed that it was not his problem and that he did not understand what benefit he would gain by participating in this game. Began twisted his lips into a malicious smile and uttered one word loudly, "Revenge." Then he tilted his head and reminded Tan that he himself had said that the huge moron was mocking and beating him. "So what?" Tan replied wearily. Began bombarded him with questions about how he felt after being beaten up recently. Was he excited? Did he feel relief? Did he feel elated by what was happening? Or was he angry at himself for not being able to take revenge personally? Tan remained silent and began, without pausing, added that Tan himself had said that even Gok Boyak couldn't land a single blow on Yun Wuken. What if one day he became so strong that he could defeat Wuken? Then revenge would be easy. He looked intently at his student and asked how he felt about that. Wouldn't it be a good gift to himself right now? Tan quietly replied that if he could really become as strong as Began said, then he would agree. He immediately explained that this had nothing to do with Boyoku. He just wanted to be stronger than he was now. Began smiled with satisfaction and said that it was fine. Let's see how it goes. After a while, Tan stood in front of his opponent, gripping his sword with both hands. Began said it was time to test his skill level. He suggested that Tan imagine he was fighting Vuken and use all his martial arts skills to their fullest. Tan moved from his place and, putting all his strength into it, began to strike many blows. But soon he felt a strange heaviness and, gasping for breath, fell to the ground. He bent over and a cough shook his whole body as if his strength had left him. Began, watching what was happening, frowned and exclaimed that it was a disgrace. He asked if Tan knew what his problem was. Tan, breathing heavily, explained that for some reason, his internal energy dissipated when he performed basic movements. At first, he thought he had not learned the clan's martial arts correctly, so he tested himself several times, but the basic movements were performed without any problems. Then he assumed that the problem was with his dantian or meridians and checked everything again in the clan, but there was no result. In despair, Tang wondered if he was simply untalented or suffering from some unknown illness. Biggin shook his head and said that wasn't the case at all. He explained that his meridian points were located further away than most people's. Tan raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked how that was possible. Bigan jumped down beside him and explained that it was a rare condition. However, since he was still young and lacked internal energy, he faced this problem. He should know that all martial arts masters must expend their internal energy, created in their dantian, through their meridian points. But since he has wider meridians than others and an average amount of internal energy, his internal energy cannot concentrate. Because of this, the energy cannot be concentrated and is scattered. Tan said with surprise that this was the first time he had heard of this. Bigan, immersed in memories of the past when he killed enemies on orders, quietly said that this was normal. And in the end, all this information was just a truth he had accidentally discovered. His gaze was focused, and his tone was filled with inner severity and calm confidence. Tan tensed up, sensing a strange atmosphere around the instructor. Deep down, he understood that there was some kind of story behind it. Bigan hugged his student and said with determination that the explanation was over. Now that Tan knew his problem, it was time to fix it. Tan asked with slight anxiety if there was a way to do that. Bigan nodded and replied confidently that of course there was, and in fact it was quite simple. He explained that compared to other people, Tan suffered from the distant location of his meridian points, which was why he lacked strength. This meant that the problem could only be solved by increasing the amount of internal energy he already had. Bigan emphasized that since it was impossible to increase internal energy in a short period of time, there was only one method he could suggest right now. He said that Tan should continue to gather internal energy without using the basic movements for now. When enough energy has accumulated, he will be able to show his true strength. Tan lunged forward and delivered one precise, concentrated blow, cutting his enemy in half. Tan exclaimed, asking if he had seen it, and that his internal energy was indeed no longer dissipating. Biggin smiled and confirmed that he had seen it with his own eyes, and now Tan could rest easy before he fell. Tan asked in surprise if he would fall, because he had never felt so energetic before. Before he could finish speaking, his body betrayed him, and he collapsed, exhausted from the internal strength he felt for the first time. When Tan woke up, the first thing he felt was slight disorientation and heaviness throughout his body. Lying on the cold floor of the training hall, he wondered why he had fallen. Biggin stood nearby and asked in a calm voice how he was feeling. Tan struggled to look up and whispered weakly that he felt weak. Bigan explained that this was just a side effect of Tan using his full power for the first time. He had never used his meridians properly before, so his body was in shock. He added that this was no cause for serious concern. The side effects would disappear in a few months. Tan breathed a sigh of relief, but then his gaze darkened as he realized what had been said. With concern, he said aloud that there was only a week left before the duel, not months. After a while, Bigan narrowed his eyes and explained that Tan was facing two serious problems at once. The first was that, using a technique based on accumulated energy, he would expend all the internal strength he had gathered over a long period of time in a single strike. After that, his body would not be able to withstand the recoil, and he would fall. The second problem is that his energy core is too small to accumulate energy in advance and hold it for a long time. If he does so, he risks falling into an energy deviation, which is why this path is strictly forbidden. The instructor looked at his student and asked if everything had been easy enough to understand so far. Tan nodded, quietly saying that he understood everything. His gaze slid to his mentor's hands and he asked how all this related to what Bigan was holding. Bigan told him not to pay attention to it and added that it was much more important to focus on the main thing. Given all the limitations, he would only be able to start gathering energy after the duel began. The instructor asked how long it used to take him to accumulate energy. Tan replied that it took about 7 minutes. Bigan raised an eyebrow and thoughtfully asked how he was going to hold out against Yeon Wookyeon for all those minutes. With anxiety in his voice, Tan asked what he should do. In response, Bigan suddenly rushed forward and attacking his student, declared that there was only one answer: to dodge as much as necessary until he gathered all his energy. Tan barely dodged the swift lunge and asked in confusion what he was doing. The instructor raised his voice and ordered him to focus and start gathering energy, keeping his eyes on the opponent's weapon. As he spoke, he used an illusion, and two opponents appeared before Tan at once, both attacking simultaneously. After several minutes of intense attacks, Began stopped and said that the student was complaining, even though he had not yet used any internal energy. His voice sounded dry and stern as he ordered him to get up and continue. Tan, breathing heavily, asked if this was training. Began explained that it was evasion training. Tan exclaimed in despair that it was crazy training. The instructor asked if Tan really thought he was doing all this just to make fun of him. He reminded his student that he had already explained why he was weak and had even demonstrated how to fix the situation. Moreover, Baigan assured him that right now this was the only way to prepare for the upcoming duel and have at least some chance of defeating Yun Wookyeon. He said that the training was hard and painful, but was it any harder than when Tan suffered humiliation from Gokbok and Yun Wookyeon himself? Then he asked if the student really intended to miss this perfect opportunity to prove his strength to everyone who treated him like trash. These words pierced Tan's consciousness. Scenes of humiliation and ridicule he had endured from his classmates flashed through his mind. Gritting his teeth, he raised his sword and said he apologized to the instructor for his cowardice. Now he was ready to continue training and assured him that he could endure the whole day if necessary. Began smiled and repeated his student's words about the whole day, then said that he was making up nonsense. His voice became cheerful when he announced that Tan would be doing this without a break for the rest of the week. Then he rushed forward, delivering another crushing blow. Tan, barely keeping his balance, cried through his tears for his mentor to stop. A week of grueling training passed. The day of the duel arrived, and all the students gathered in the training hall to witness the fight. Tan entered the hall, his body covered in bruises and abrasions, his movements cautious. Whispers could be heard in the crowd. One of the students said curiously how long Tan would last. Another said that he would be defeated with one blow and fall to the ground. Someone else wondered if Tan had prepared any countermeasures. The guy said he had seen him several times in passing, but Tan had simply spent the whole week getting beaten with a stick. Gokboyak looked at this with contempt and thought about what an idiot Tan was, reasoning that if he was trash, he should just sit quietly in the corner. He snorted when he noticed that this weakling standing in front of everyone was going to defeat Yun Wookyeon. Nonsense. His gaze turned to the instructor, and he thought that Tan had fallen for this swindler's trick and dug his own grave. At that moment, Yun Wookyeon stepped forward and reminded the instructor that he had previously claimed that he didn't need anything, but under these circumstances, he wanted to set his own condition. Began narrowed his eyes and asked what exactly. Wookyeon said that if he won, the instructor had to promise to leave the academy. He added that he had no intention of ever wasting his precious time again. Began smiled and said that he swore by his name that he would keep his word. Then he asked if he knew what would happen if he lost. He would have to attend classes and training without complaint. Wookyeon replied that he remembered that. Began said that now Wookyeon should focus not on him, but on Tan Lee-jun, who was already standing in the arena. The instructor announced the rules. Victory would be determined if one of the sides surrendered, lost consciousness, or dropped their weapon. He also added that any fatal or life-threatening blows were strictly prohibited, and that he, as the judge, would make the final decision in controversial situations. Began raised his hand, and silence fell over the hall. His voice echoed across the arena as he announced that the duel was about to begin. Tan stood in a tense fighting stance, gripping his sword so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breathing was steady, but his heart was pounding in his chest like a drum. In an instant, he felt a sharp pain, as if someone had cut his arm. He flinched, but when he looked at his limb, he saw that it was intact. Wookyeon's cold smile flashed before his eyes, urging Tan to surrender. Wookyeon asked if Tan had agreed to fight him. Shaken by just one hint of his murderous intent, Tan felt a chill down his spine and thought that this was real murderous intent. He thought with horror that if Wookyeon wanted to, he could kill him with a single move. Fear gradually took hold of him. An inner voice whispered that victory was impossible. Tan mentally admitted to himself that he was weak and insignificant, that everyone considered Wookyeon to be the best of the best at the academy. A week of training would not make him a worthy opponent. He was almost drowning in his own doubts when he heard Began's voice. The mentor called him by name, and the voice sounded like thunder in a clear sky. Tan looked up and saw Bigon tapping his palm menacingly with his baton, as if reminding him of his promises and the effort he had put in. Tan closed his eyes tightly and reminded himself firmly that he wanted to become stronger than he had ever been. He remembered the day he decided he no longer wanted to be weak and would put all his energy into achieving that goal. Wookyun sighed, his voice a mixture of fatigue and contempt as he said that he had given his opponent a chance to leave the arena unharmed. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and in an instant he disappeared from the spot, as if he had dissolved into thin air. Appearing in the air above Tan, Wukyan swung his sword with force and said in a cold voice that Tan was to blame for his own choice. But Tan was already on guard. He tensed his whole body, watching his opponent's every move closely, and was able to raise his sword in time to block the blow. Wukyan raised his eyebrows in surprise, his thoughts flashing as quickly as his sword strikes. He did not expect Tan to react in time. Tan, jumping back, realized that he was on the verge of defeat. He thought that the attack could have ended in disaster, and the gathered ki had almost dissipated. Wukyan swung his sword again and used the technique Supreme Dragon Sword, cutting through the sky, the first technique of Berserker's Dragon Fury. The sword's ki spread across the arena with such power that Tanya gasped. He barely managed to dodge the blows and noted with surprise that the attacks did not seem as inevitable as he had expected. The academy students watched the fight in amazement, many unable to believe their eyes. Even Wukong admitted aloud that his opponent had indeed learned something from the instructor. Then he moved on to the next technique, the third technique, Double Dragon Fangs. Tan felt a sense of recognition, for he had already seen this technique. It was the same one that instructor Sa had used a week ago. He reacted immediately to the technique and jumped up, dodging with surprising ease. Wukyan was forced to rush after him, showering his opponent with a barrage of quick and accurate strikes. Tan mentally noted that his opponent's skill was impressive, but it did not make him invincible. He remembered every move of his instructor, every training session, every pain, and honed his evasions to perfection. Wukyan, noticing that none of his blows had reached their target, decided to retreat sharply. Shouts of surprise rang out from the stands. Many could not believe what had happened. Wukyan gripped his sword tighter and apologized for calling Tanya an idiot. He admitted that he had learned a lot in a week. Then Wukyan focused his energy and declared that if Tan could dodge the next blow, he would admit defeat. He prepared to use the Supreme Dragon Sword, the fourth technique of cruel dragon destruction. The arena shook from the power of this attack, and the spectators gasped in awe and horror. Boyak, who was watching the fight, only whispered a curse, realizing how terrifying this technique was. Tan was initially confused, but he focused, remembering Bigon's words, and began to move toward this technique. He clearly remembered that night when, after exhausting training, he was breathing heavily, feeling every muscle in his body screaming with fatigue. Bigon watched him with an impassive expression and said that he was dodging well. Now it might be possible. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Tan looked up at his mentor and asked if this would really allow him to dodge all of Yon Wukyun's attacks. Without hesitation, Bigon replied coldly that it would not. These words struck Tan harder than any sword. Bigon explained with cold confidence in his voice that Yon Wukyung was not an idiot at all. He noted that right now, this guy was probably underestimating his opponent. But if Tan continued to deftly dodge his sword strikes, Wukyan would inevitably take more drastic measures, and he would surely use the most powerful sword technique he could currently employ. He then added that this technique has the terrifying name of Cruel Destruction of the Dragon. This art gives the impression that a fierce dragon has materialized in reality and is a martial art that creates a powerful sword chi. He immediately warned Tang that it was impossible to dodge such a blow. Any attempts to jump aside or retreat are useless, because this technique instantly expands and engulfs the entire arena. Bigon sternly said that one should not succumb to illusions, for there is nothing truly invincible in this world. He explained that the sword Koi Storm, moving in all directions without stopping, only seems flawless, but in reality, this martial art is not perfect. Bigon emphasized that the brutal destruction of the dragon was primarily intended to intimidate enemies, who would be overwhelmed by its incredible power and seek to flee. He said that the only way out is to move forward without allowing oneself to be cornered. But at the same time, he warned that when it comes to Wukyon, he will certainly try to react instantly, realizing that his greatest technique has been figured out. However, this reaction would only be an impulsive response to an unexpected situation. Biggin added that this moment would be Tan's decisive chance. He told him to use the suppressed rage that the young man had kept inside for so long and strike this arrogant opponent. Wokyun was shocked and did not have time to anticipate his opponent's swift attack. Trying to block it, he was met with the crushing force of the attack, and his sword shattered into pieces. At that moment, Bigan stepped forward, confidently took Tan by the shoulder, and asked how he was feeling. A wave of shock and surprise swept through the arena. Some students beamed with joy and congratulated Tan, while others simply froze in bewilderment, unable to believe their eyes. Bigan smiled contentedly and said that the outcome of this battle was truly wonderful. Tan, breathing heavily, replied with relief that he had been able to do it. The next day, Bigan came to training. Opening the door to the hall, he noticed that absolutely all the students had gathered. This meant only one thing. Yesterday's fight had made a strong impression and compelled everyone to come. His gaze fell on Vukan's gloomy face, but he just grunted and said it was time to start a new lesson. Meanwhile, Semyon clenched his fist with all his might and slammed it down on the heavy table with a thud. His voice was angry as he exclaimed, "Damn it, aren't these bastards the very people who supported this plan just a minute ago?" His face contorted with anger, and his eyes flashed with cold fury as he asked how everything could have turned out this way. Woonjin asked if the goal wasn't for Sao Bigan to leave of his own accord. But why instead were the students voluntarily following this man? Wookyoung and Dan now openly declare that they want to continue their studies under Sabigan's guidance. Bok asked what would happen if they tried to transfer them to other classes again, as before. Semyon replied that they were now even threatening to leave the academy. Another man grimly remarked that the academy should never have entrusted such a brilliant student as Yeon Wookyoung to the hands of some novice. At that moment, Semyon was thinking furiously, wondering how the academy's vice master, Jong, was going to take responsibility for this disgrace. He asked a new question. Had Yeon Wookyoung really lost to some low-ranking brat from the One-Star Sword clan? One of the masters said that according to the students who watched the fight, it looked like a real defeat. Someone said that Yeon Wookyoung was one of the greatest geniuses in history, even by the standards of his own clan. He thought that the more he got to know Bigan, the less he understood this man. He decided that Bigan could not be left unattended, and asked sharply if they had received a response from the Ghost Shadow estate. Woonjin replied that since they sent the request, the people from the estate had only promised to consider it. Semyon said with contempt that a simple group of mercenaries dared to act arrogantly. His words were interrupted by a harsh voice that sounded in the room like a cold wind cutting through the walls. The voice warned that everyone here had better be careful with their words and actions. All the martial arts masters turned sharply and began to ask who dared to utter those words. The man with a cold expression on his face, who appeared behind Seaman, said that it was a stupid question. Seaman realized that standing before him was a man whose presence he had not sensed at all, even though he himself was a martial arts master of the highest rank. The man said in a cold tone that they had called him here themselves. Soon, several more people appeared behind him. The leader of the group said that they were there to fulfill a request. Then he demanded to be told more about Sabigan. The martial arts masters handed him a sketch of Sabigan. One of the Ghost Shadow people smirked and said that they were spending hundreds of nyangs just to investigate the life of a novice instructor. Another remarked that for a place with such a reputation, the academy seemed to be rolling in money. A third person said that this was a sign of how corrupt they were, but that it was none of their business. The seventh member of the group asked if they found these sectarians ridiculous, as they always portrayed themselves as paragons of virtue, but now they were secretly ordering an investigation into their own subordinates. The fifth member of the group added with a smirk that they were no better themselves, since they were taking on such petty assignments for money. The leader looked at him coldly and asked if he had forgotten the mission they had sworn to. Their oath required them to accept any dirty and despicable task until they found and subjugated their target. The fifth member instantly bowed and hastily apologized for his words. The leader waved him off and ordered him to focus on the task at hand. The fifth cautiously asked if they should also investigate Jean Beck, the man who, according to rumors, had raised Sa Bigan since childhood. The leader replied that their goal now was to observe Bigan. The seventh member thoughtfully asked if the rumors that Sa Bigan had had a fateful encounter were true. According to rumors, this man supposedly did not know how to use his inner energy, but then became a martial arts master overnight. If this was not the result of a fateful encounter, then what could it be? He suggested that Began had infiltrated here after being introduced by some hostile faction with dark intentions. This was probably what the client suspected, which was why they had hired us. The first of the hidden fighters spoke firmly and coldly so that the target would not know about them, and ordered everyone to be extremely careful. The first one stated that no matter how strong Biggin was, he would never be able to notice the ghost's hidden techniques. Hearing this, the leader gave the order to prepare. It all starts right now. Meanwhile, at the other end of the academy, Biggin and Back were walking along a stone-paved path and looking at the river. Back said that he had recently heard a lot about Biggin's exploits at the academy, and that everything he had heard had caused him genuine surprise. He asked anxiously if Biggin was sure that everything would be all right, since there were many people around who were against him. Biggin replied calmly that jealousy and envy always accompany the path of a hero, and there was nothing to worry about. Beck said that their fateful meeting was probably truly incredible, and who would have thought that Began would change so much? He continued to ponder aloud that perhaps it all began with that very duel that shocked everyone at the time. Even he himself was amazed by that battle. But if Began had lost then, the consequences would have been catastrophic, because the Academy's vice master, Cheon, was clearly trying to get rid of him. These words brought back a flood of memories for Began. Before fate gave him a second chance, he was weak, and in one of the duels, Sondok brutally defeated him. He was then stripped of his position as assistant instructor, demoted to a handyman, and ultimately left the academy himself, unable to bear the shame. In those days, he wandered the world, without a goal or even a means of subsistence. Eventually, he managed to become a mercenary at a security agency. Although he still couldn't use his internal energy, Began tempered his body. He survived dozens of missions, attacks by sects, bandits, and mercenaries. Years of trials tempered him, and one day he earned the title of first-rank warrior. He spent more than 10 years in this profession, visiting every corner of the Central Plains, and during that time he built up a network of connections and sources of information. And then, already a different person, he returned to the academy in memory of the old days. And it was on that very day, in the evening, that monsters appeared and began to destroy everything in their path. Suddenly, Began frowned and threw a stone straight into the thick bushes by the roadside. Back looked at him in surprise and asked why he did that. Began replied that he had simply seen an ugly frog and couldn't resist. Back was indignant and asked why he had decided to harm a harmless creature. Began reminded him how as a child he had fed him frogs, using them as medicine. They moved on, unaware that ghostly shadows were hiding in the bushes. The fighters of the Ghost Manor emerged from the greenery. The seventh hissed in pain, clutching his head. Fifth asked if everything was all right. Seventh hissed through clenched teeth that the madman had thrown a rock at him. He suggested that they might have been discovered, but the fifth said that if Began had noticed them, he would not have left so calmly. The seventh was probably just unlucky. The fifth reminded his colleague not to doubt the cultivation techniques of the manor because of such a trifle. Receiving confirmation of obedience, he briefly ordered the seventh to return to his quarters and continue observing. By this time, Began was already sitting in his room, allowing himself a short respite. He thought that the first goal after regression had been achieved, and now it was time to move on to the next step. If his memory served him correctly, she should be in that very place right now. He felt a slight movement of air behind the door and said loudly that the door was open and she could come in. Wookyeon stepped into the room. He noticed that Began was acting as if he had been waiting for him. Began calmly replied that this was exactly what he had expected, because Wookyeon had already started to get nervous. Wookyeon frowned and asked what kind of disgusting expression Began had on his face. Began asked what had brought the young master of the Destructive Swords clan, Yeon, to such a modest place. Not hearing an answer, he lazily stretched out on the bed and repeated his question, now with a hint of curiosity. Wookyeon, standing in the middle of the room with a tense expression, finally spoke. He recalled the duel during which Tan was able, albeit with mistakes, to react to all his movements, to the technique of the Supreme Dragon Sword. Wookyeon admitted that he initially thought it was the result of a week of training, but these were movements that went beyond random reactions. He added that everything that was happening resembled a situation where the opponent knew every movement of his blade and all the trajectories of his attacks in advance. Wukyun looked coldly and said that the only one who could have taught Tan the sword art of his clan was Begone. How could an outsider know the martial arts of the Yon-destructive sword clan in such detail? Begone smiled lazily and said, "Who knows? The martial arts of the Destroying Swords clan, now considered the greatest among all the sword clans of Zhongyuan. And they are well known in the world of martial arts masters. Didn't Wukyong find that logical?" Wukyong gritted his teeth and sharply stated that this was not superficial knowledge at all. He asked if Begone really thought he wouldn't notice something like that. The instructor chuckled and admitted that, of course, Wukyong should have noticed. If he hadn't, Begone would have been very disappointed. He stood up, came closer, and suggested that the young man be more honest if he really wanted to become his student. In fact, that wasn't what interested him. Begone stated that he had come to check whether he knew the same weaknesses of the supreme dragon sword that cuts through the heavens that the young man himself had already managed to sense. He explained that this style had been perfected hundreds of years ago and was passed down in the clan as a unique martial art. It was considered the greatest in Zhongyuan for its incredible destructive power, changing sword trajectories, and lack of weak points. But from an early age when Wukyong began to study this technique, he showed outstanding insight. He already understood that the supreme dragon sword, destroying the heavens, was not an invincible martial art. He said that as the heir to the great clan of destructive swords, he simply could not allow himself to admit this. Wukyong asked sharply if Begone looked down on his clan's martial arts. Begone shrugged and said that Wukyong could think whatever he wanted, but he would say only one thing. The day would come when all these things, tradition, honor, nobility, and reputation, so revered by martial arts masters, would lose all meaning. Begone suggested that he remember only one thing, to become stronger than he was now. He said that on this path, one must unhesitatingly cast aside everything that stands in the way. Begone turned away and said that they would find time to discuss this in detail later. For now, he advised the young man to follow his instincts. Wukyun frowned and asked why he had suddenly grabbed the wooden pillow. Begone smiled and said it was nothing special and asked him not to pay attention to it. He referred to the fact that some annoying frog could be heard outside. Later that evening, First, watching the old man, said aloud that Master Jin Bak of the Body Restoration Pavilion was a strange man. He used to be a doctor working in GAMS, but 5 years ago he became responsible for the Body Restoration Pavilion, where patients were treated and entered the Dragon Spring Academy. The fifth reminded him that despite his medical abilities, Jin Bak had barely mastered martial arts and did not seem to have much experience in other areas. The first confirmed that they had checked him out as he was closest to Begone, but he appeared to be a very ordinary medic. However, his impeccable past seemed a little artificial to the first. At that moment, he noticed movement and turned to his partner, asking number 7 what was wrong with him. Number 7 grimaced and said that a rock and a wooden pillow had hit him. The first frowned and asked if he was sure they hadn't been discovered. The fifth objected that if they had really been discovered, no one would have gotten away so easily. The seventh sighed heavily and admitted that he still suspected they had been exposed. The first one cut him off sharply and said that there was no reason to doubt the common sense of his clan. It was just Begone's bad habit of throwing things away. They had faced worse situations, so he advised them to be patient for a while. Seventh reluctantly agreed. They spent the whole day watching Begone from the bushes, and only by morning did the seventh lose his patience. He warned his partners in advance that if this happened again, he would not hold back and would personally behead the madman. Fifth, trying to calm him down, reminded him that they had moved out of the dormitory and that there would be no more incidents like this. Seventh snorted and added that who knows, maybe this lunatic would decide to practice archery. But a sudden movement in the bushes made them fall silent. The fifth quietly ordered everyone to hide. Begone slowly approached the bushes and muttered aloud that he wasn't feeling well. Then he sighed, stretching his pants, and said that he had probably drunk too much tea. The seventh, pressed against the ground, thought with horror that this was simply impossible. But in the next second, a stream flew onto his head. The fifth froze in complete shock. The seventh, enraged, jumped out of the bushes and shouted, calling Begone crazy. Begone, standing with the teapot in his hands, raised it and asked with a smile if the seventh wanted a cup of tea. The seventh, trembling with rage, shouted that Begone had known all along and had done it on purpose. He drew his sword and rushed forward with lightning speed, saying he would kill him. However, Begone did not even flinch, because a barrier of such strength instantly appeared around him that the enemy's blades shattered into pieces. He grabbed the seventh's arm and with his other hand grabbed his face and threw him to the ground with such ease as if he were throwing a bag of grass. His voice sounded almost cheerful when he said, "Nice to meet you, Ghost Shadow Manor." The seventh was badly wounded and lost consciousness from the crushing blow. Began, looking at his motionless body, said with a cold smile that this was exactly what he deserved for meddling in other people's affairs. Then he looked up and addressed the other, greeting his dear friends from the estate of ghostly shadows. The fifth, whose heart was beating rapidly, had already reached for his weapon, but the first one appeared, stopping him. The first one said in an even voice that he welcomed instructor Sa Began, and that apparently they had indeed been exposed. Began smiled and said that he was the one they were following, and that he must be the leader of these frogs. He tilted his head slightly and said that it was really not normal to reveal one's identity so carelessly to the object of surveillance. The first one slowly drew his sword and said mockingly that this question was stupid, because if he killed Began right here and now, it would no longer be a problem. Began smiled and asked a counter question, whether this option really suited his enemy, and whether he wasn't even interested in finding out how he himself was so well informed about everything related to their organization. The first one suddenly lunged forward, tearing through the air with a shout that they would soon find out everything. He declared that he would start by cutting off Began's limbs one by one. His sword turned into a blurred line of light, delivering a series of lightning-fast blows, each designed to kill. But Began, activating his manacap, moved just as quickly and coolly. His movements were precise, each step carefully thought out. The first one abruptly changed the angle of attack and tried to bypass the enemy, coming in from his blind side. But Began, anticipating this maneuver, intercepted the blow and blocked it with such speed that it seemed as if he had been waiting for this very moment. A slight smile appeared on his face as he said that there was no need to rush. The first one growled and quickened the pace of his attack, his sword turning into a stream of flashes that threatened to tear the air apart. Began mentally noted that although he lacked the overwhelming destructive power of Agaham, this opponent was incredibly fast, accurate, and deadly. He was particularly impressed by the density of energy contained in this sword. The barrier would not withstand such pressure, and he would not be able to continue parrying the blows with only his mana blade for long. The first one stepped back sharply and, holding his breath, said that he did not understand what was going on. He added that Began's strength and style were completely unlike the martial arts of orthodox sects. He said he couldn't believe that Began had simply stumbled upon such power, and asked if it was demonic art. Began asked if the first had ever seen demonic arts with his own eyes, and reminded him that years had passed since the demon cult had fallen. He said that such suspicions were nonsense, and although his technique was indeed not a conventional martial art, it had nothing to do with demonic arts. The first gripped the hilt of his sword tighter, his voice becoming firmer. He now understood that this man was not someone who could simply be subjugated. He emphasized that he had no personal grudge against Began, but he would have to take his life in order to fulfill his mission. His silhouette dissolved into thin air as he whispered that all this was being done in the name of fulfilling their organization's mission. In an instant, he vanished, using the soul-destroying step, a unique movement technique that completely erased all traces of his presence. It confused the enemy with a speed that exceeded the perception of the ordinary eye. He then used the phantom soul flash technique. In an instant, his sword cut through space, severing Began's arm. This strike was so swift that it was impossible to predict. However, Began already knew this technique. He used an illusory technique and found himself next to the first at the moment of attack. His strike was lightning fast and so powerful that it sent his enemy flying like a cannonball. The first, breathing heavily, asked in shock how he had managed to do such a thing. Began approached and asked with a cold sneer if the first was proud of his stealth skills. His gaze became piercing as he said that thanks to a special search technique, he could see right through him. Moving closer, Began said that they really needed to talk. He addressed his opponent, calling him not the lord of the Ghost Shadow Estate, but the leader of the Origin sect. The Origin sect never appeared at official events. No one knew whether to classify it as an orthodox organization. Their true goals and the sect itself were shrouded in mystery. This was so important that decades ago, when all the direct heirs, including the sect leader, were killed during the massacre, most of the Zhonghu didn't even notice their disappearance. Only those who were born and raised within the walls of the Origin sect, who were loyal to it until the end, knew the true truth. The survivors of the tragedy reappeared under a different name, becoming the Ghost Shadow Manor. Now they gather every bit of information throughout Zhonghu. The Ghost Shadow Manor has now become an elite mercenary organization that takes on the dirtiest, most difficult, and deadly dangerous tasks. Biggin calmly stated that all these actions were aimed at a single goal: the restoration of the fallen sect of the Origins. That's the mission they all talk about so often, isn't it? The first one said it was impossible because the true history of their sect was kept a closely guarded secret. Bigan said that they only had to complete 2 missions, and then he would give them the information they had been searching for so long. The first one couldn't take it anymore, and exclaimed that they had spent 20 years, 2 decades of searching, wandering, and hoping for this mission, and now someone dared to talk to them like that. Unable to contain his emotions, he shouted the question, did Bigan understand what exactly they were looking for? Bigan quietly replied that they were looking for the blood of the Origin sect, or more precisely, a unique lineage capable of fully inheriting the martial arts of this sect. He asked if the person they were looking for had a strange birthmark on their left wrist. Was that correct? His thoughts spun in a whirlwind of horror as he realized that Bigan was right. Their entire purpose, the entire existence of the Ghost Shadow Estate, was devoted to finding this person. But even within their organization, only a select few knew this secret. So how could this man know about it? Bigun said that was all he could tell him for now. Now it was up to the first to choose whether to accept his offer and get answers or wander and search for the rest of his days. He suggested, as an alternative, simply continuing what they had been doing all this time. The first sighed heavily, gripped the hilt of his sword, folded it, and bowed respectfully. He said he accepted the task, but if it turned out that Bigan had deceived them, he would swear revenge. Bigan just smiled and said it was a wise decision, then informed him that he would give the first one his first task. Night lay over the village like thick silk when an uninvited guest, light as a shadow, slipped into the house. She acted quickly and accurately, targeting the most vulnerable points on people's bodies. The last one left was a man who was unable to move and began to beg for mercy incoherently. The girl concentrated a deadly stream of ki in her hands and began to reach for his face. Suddenly, she paused for a moment, looked him in the eyes, and said that she was facing the deputy leader of the Black Scorpion gang, the fist-fighting demon Manhwa. Then she reminded him that a month ago, he and his subordinates had attacked this place, killed all the men, and dishonored all the women. There was a smoldering anger in her voice as she said that the survivors had entrusted her with killing him. Manhwa tried to gather his strength. With a familiar movement, he summoned his inner flow, but only an empty echo responded inside him. He thought in despair that he could not gather his inner energy, and then felt with horror how it was slowly disappearing, as if slipping through his fingers. He croaked with hatred, cursing her and threatening future retribution, reminding her that he was the Black Scorpion's deputy and asking if she was afraid of the consequences. The girl indifferently raised her sword and remarked that she had already mentioned this. "You idiot." The blade barely trembled, and all of Manhwa's energy, which had been boiling inside her just a moment ago, disappeared. She finished cleanly and without delay. When everything quieted down, the killer took a deep breath, and with that breath, her features floated and changed. A bird flew to her and landed on her hand, a narrow strip of paper tied to its leg. The girl untied the knot, glanced at it, and said quietly that the next task concerned the instructor of the Dragon Spring Academy, Bigan. In the morning, the training hall was buzzing with the breath of the students. Bigan walked between the rows and corrected mistakes. He said sternly, "Enough with the nonsense, it's time to let off some steam." He advised them to spread their legs apart and tilt their wrists slightly downward. He added that they needed to do another 200 repetitions in that position. The boy said, "Damn it." Bigan asked what kind of disrespectful tone that was, and if he really didn't like his methods. The boy quickly said that before he got a slap, he should be given a chance to speak. The boy pointed his finger at Wukyoung and asked why he wasn't being forced to do anything. Bigan said that Wukyoung was doing just fine on his own. The student blurted out that he wasn't doing anything at all and was probably sleeping. The answer came in the form of a slap on the head. Bigan said that he shouldn't compare himself to Wukyoung and told him to shut up and work harder with his sword. He glanced at Wukyoung, who was repeating the movements with his eyes closed. and thought that it was good not to get attached to the forms of the supreme dragon sword, but to fence as his intuition dictated. His genius talent would help him reach a higher level in a short time. Tan approached cautiously and began asked if he had completed the full circulation of qi. Tan admitted that he had not and added that he was still nervous. He asked if he could just do as he was told and continue to circulate the energy in a circle. Began replied calmly that there was no other way. His problem would only be solved by accumulating a sufficient amount of internal strength. Then he added that this was only true if Tan wasn't hiding rare elixirs somewhere. Tan waved his hands and said no, of course not. Began, already leaving, threw over his shoulder that then, apart from eating and sleeping, he should not stop the circulation for a moment. He thought the guy was in too much of a hurry, probably realizing that he had defeated Wukyeon in a duel with cunning and now craving real power. There was nothing to be done about it. It was not a problem that could be solved immediately. And moreover, there was a more important question. Had it really been 10 days since then? If no one got in touch, there might be a problem with his plan. Suddenly, someone called out to him by his title, and Bagan turned around and replied that it had been a long time since they had seen each other and that he was glad to meet him. Boyun said that Began didn't seem too happy to see him and asked why he had such an expression on his face as soon as he saw him. Began explained that he was busy with a lesson and that visits were distracting. Bukyun snorted and said that he had been loafing around since morning. Remembering his murder, he thought that if he hadn't seen that scene, he would have said everything he was thinking. He said that he needed to go to the main hall immediately because the vice master of the academy, Jung Seomon, wanted to see him. Semyong said gloomily that he hadn't seen Instructor Sa in a long time and asked how he was doing. Began replied too cheerfully that everything was fine, that it was a pleasure and an honor to teach students with such outstanding talents. And of course, he was grateful to the gifted class system created by the leadership. Semin said he was glad to hear that, but as far as he knew, they were the Dragon Spring Academy, a martial arts academy affiliated with the Orthodox Alliance. After Bigan's promotion to senior instructor, the Alliance had too many questions. Bigan asked with a hint of irony if the Alliance was really interested in a simple instructor like him. Semun gently rebuked him, asking him to be more respectful, and informed him that the Alliance had sent an inspector to assist him. A girl in light-colored clothes stepped forward, bowed her head, and introduced herself as Mei Solon from the Orthodox Alliance's inspection department. For a brief moment, Began seemed to lose his hearing and froze. The girl called him several times. He came to his senses and said with a sudden lively smile that he apologized and that he was simply enchanted by her beauty. Mei Solon thanked him for the compliment. Someone explained that Inspector Mei was a rising star among the Alliance's masters, an incredible talent who had reached great heights at an unprecedented young age. He asked Began to behave carefully and not be rude to her. Began smiled broadly and bowed, replying that of course he understood everything. He remembered the first task he had assigned to the people from the estate of ghostly shadows. A brief conversation with their leader came to mind, and he asked if he knew a killer nicknamed the Heavenly Maiden who takes souls. The leader said he didn't understand why that name was mentioned here, but of course he knew her. A hired killer, working alone, not connected to anyone, she had never failed a single job. He added that he had never met her personally, but her victims were found as if sucked dry from the inside, and rumors say that she is incomparably beautiful. Then he cautiously asked if their mission was to kill the Heavenly Maiden who took souls. Began replied briefly that no, they needed to bring the Heavenly Maiden to the academy. He ordered that Chan Semyon be told that due to unforeseen circumstances, the job would have to be canceled. After a while, Seoman's anger struck the hall like a clap of thunder. He said it was irresponsible to cancel the order. The former bowed his head, apologized, and explained that an urgent matter had arisen. But in return, he offered a person who was perfectly suited for the task and promised to pay the commission as compensation. He told Began that he was able to contact the killer and persuade her, as he had already worked with her. The first man couldn't resist asking why he would do such a foolish thing, because no matter how strong Began was, this woman would find a way to kill him. Began smiled and asked if he was really worried about him. The first man said that if Began died before passing on the promised information, he would be in a difficult dilemma. Began said that he was right, the woman was dangerous. Then he added that this was precisely why he needed her even more. In the future, a fierce battle would rage, in which Began gave all his strength. He gathered all his energy and, casting a double spell, rose into the sky using the techniques of the hollow cannon and judgment thunder. Terrant turned to him with a smirk, as if challenging him to retaliate, and asked if that was all he could do. Began thought to himself in surprise that he had already used 8th class magic in a row, and yet there was not a scratch left on his body. Terrant continued, his voice sounding threatening as he said to resist even more strongly, or else he would be executed immediately. Began, with fury cutting through his voice, shouted for him to shut up immediately, "You bastard." He concentrated his energy, creating a huge seal, and released a powerful atomic explosion. Terrant reacted in time and reached out his hand, absorbing all of its powerful energy. Recognition flashed through Bigan's mind. It was a 9th grade spell, a spell of extreme destruction. It does not disappear when touched by one's own hand. Realizing this, he understood that the absorbed energy would return to him twice as strong. He created a high-level shield, but as soon as the beam hit it, the shield instantly shattered. Began suddenly opened his eyes and found himself in his room, trembling and breathing heavily. He thought to himself that no matter how many times he went through it, the memory always remained damn awful. After a while, it seemed to him that he had climbed over the highest mountain, and after the regression, the speed of the search and ensuring the safety of Meisalan became one of the most important priorities. The problem was that he did not know her exact location during this period of time. Fortunately, John Samyong and the Ghost Shadow Manor were acting strictly according to plan. And in the future, even Dan Lejong and Yong Wookyung, the strongest forces, would not be able to match Meisalan's abilities. The next step for Bigan was to conduct training and observe her skills. He saw his students and, approaching them, heard the boy say that if a fairy had descended to Earth, she would look exactly like her. Bigan saw how skillfully and precisely she wielded her sword, as if it were an extension of her arm. After finishing her training, Solon turned to him and greeted him with a good morning, adding that she had waved her sword a little during her morning training and hoped she hadn't distracted him. Bigan smiled and greeted her, saying that her sword skills were excellent. She admitted that everything had gone well and wanted to find him to talk. Bigan asked curiously if she was addressing him. She nodded and asked if he would mind taking a short walk with her. Alone, Bigan noted her remarkable skills and said that this was to be expected from a member of the Orthodox Alliance. Solon replied shyly that there were stronger martial artists in the Alliance. Bigan thought to himself how shameless of her, since she was an inspector and part of the Alliance, but her whole personality was a lie. Solon noted that he was impressive. She had recently heard that he had won a public duel with a single blow. And even alone, he managed to defeat the infamous Green Forest Alliance. She admitted that he was much more like an incredible martial arts master than she was. Bigan thought, wow, she had already conducted an investigation and said that it was just luck, because he had recently stumbled upon a fateful encounter and there was nothing to brag about. Solon said she disagreed, because the students say that although his methods may be cruel lately, he helps them solve problems. He doesn't discriminate based on origin and is a wonderful instructor. Bigan asked in surprise if that was what the students thought of him and said what good kids they were. Solon added that his hands were covered in calluses and muscles. For more than 10 years, he has not let go of his weapon, not even for a single day. He trains endlessly, despite countless tears. He had suffered countless injuries and recoveries, too many to count. Only in this way could such hands be created. She said that Bigan should be proud of himself not because of some fateful encounter, but because he is truly a master of martial arts. Then Solon approached and said that he had never told her in detail about that fateful encounter. She asked if he could tell her more about the incident. Bigan admitted that this power did not come from a miraculous encounter, that he did not want it, and that the reason he claimed otherwise was simply because it was a convenient explanation. He mentioned the cult of the demonic spirit and asked if Solon had heard of a group with that name. Solon grabbed his clothes sharply and asked threateningly how he knew that name. Bigan covered his face with his hand, hiding his smile, and realized that she had fallen into his trap. Several decades ago, even before the demon invasion began, there was a powerful religious organization known as the Heavenly Demon Sect. It was a demonic cult where seekers of power were initiated into the teachings of the Heavenly Demon and developed their abilities to terrifying extremes. Their growth became a threat, and the central provinces declared them heretics, launching an offensive to destroy their influence. The result was a great war, one of the bloodiest and most extensive in the history of Jianghu. It happened long before the demons appeared, and in this war, cultists and orthodox believers clashed. Many strong warriors met their deaths on the battlefields, but in the end, the Central Plain won the victory and completely destroyed the cult. Many years have passed since then, and the sect seems to have disappeared. The world found peace, or rather, it seemed to have found peace, because in reality, everything was different. The few surviving followers of the demonic cult did not disappear completely, but went into hiding and created a secret order, the cult of the demonic spirit, which the government of the Central Plains did not suspect. Those who had personally encountered its representatives knew of its existence. Solon asked what connected Began to this cult of the demonic spirit. Began exclaimed in surprise and irritation, asking her what had gotten into her. He said he was ready to explain everything, but first she had to let him go. The girl, flustered, immediately apologized, admitting that she had lost control of herself for a moment. Began bowed his head and narrowed his eyes, noting that something else was much more important. Judging by her reaction, Inspector May clearly knew much more about the cult. Solon admitted that the mere mention of the demon spirit cult meant much more to her than one could imagine. She asked Began to tell her more about where exactly he had gotten this information. Began replied that he was ready to explain everything to the inspector and told his story. He recalled that it happened immediately after he was officially removed from his position as assistant instructor. In those days, he thought a lot about why he was unable to awaken his inner energy, and one late night he went for a walk outside the academy. His gaze darkened as he said that it was on that very night that he had been kidnapped. Solon, not expecting to hear such a confession, asked him to repeat himself. Began said that was exactly how it happened. He didn't know how to react, and when he woke up, he saw a man whose image was forever etched in his memory. The masked man said in a cold, ominous voice that if Began dared to resist, he would disappear without a trace, as if he had never existed. He demanded that Began accept his fate and consider it an honor to serve the cause of the Great Revival. This mysterious man called himself the demonic scientist. From then on, Began was subjected to cruel trials, inhuman experiments, and forced to swallow poisonous and unknown substances. They performed painful operations that tore apart his body and internal organs. He went through a real hell. At some point, when he regained consciousness, he found himself alone. It was then that he realized that he could not use his internal energy, but instead had received the true power of heavenly chi. Clenching a ball of fire, he explained that such a rare power was known only to a few. To master it, one must pay with one's own life force. Solon, listening to this story, admitted that she found it hard to believe. Began replied that he had no internal energy and that otherwise he would not be able to use this power. He added that if necessary, he could prove his words right now. He knew that it all sounded unbelievable, but she would have no choice but to believe his confession. Although the very existence of true heavenly chi remains in question, his knowledge of the demon spirit cult is based on his own experience. He asked if she was ready to believe him. If she still had doubts, he invited her to go with him to the place where he was imprisoned, where he endured all those torments, and where he was ultimately left alone, like an unwanted prisoner. Began explained with an impassive expression that when he woke up, all the instruments used to experiment on him had disappeared, but perhaps there were traces of what had happened. However, getting there would not be easy, and they had already heard enough stories for one day. The man suggested that if the inspector did not object, they would meet tomorrow night outside the academy, from where he would take her to this place. In reality, every word he said was a lie. In his past life, he had never encountered followers of the demon spirit cult, and his power had nothing to do with the legendary true heavenly chi and was a kind of magic unknown in this world. All the lies were a necessity, a tool to exploit her trust, but he did not lie about the painful experiments that were conducted every day in the future. One monster asked about the condition of the subject. The second replied that initially the organism completely rejected the demonic energy, but over time its receptivity increased, which in itself seemed incredible. He noted that compared to creatures from other dimensions, this human was a rare specimen. The other monster smiled and said that this was curious, because by the standards of his own dimension, he was considered one of the weakest representatives of his race. They were ordered to make sure the prisoner did not die too quickly, and to expose him to increasingly stronger demonic energy each time. The monster obediently promised to carry out the order. The heavy gates swung open, and the exhausted Bigan was unceremoniously thrown outside. A man standing nearby rushed to him and, seeing the horrific wounds, exclaimed furiously that these demonic creatures were true monsters. Two men who had rushed to his aid lifted him by the shoulders and told him to hold on with all his strength. The girl looked at his wounded body and noted that the enemies had done their best, and suggested that this day would be the day of his death. Bigan smiled weakly and confidently declared that she would be next. The girl laughed, reached out her hand to him, and said with a slight sneer that it seemed too early for him to die. Bigan was lost in dark memories of the painful years he had spent in captivity. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint rustle, and he cautiously said that he sensed someone's presence and demanded that they come out of hiding. When no one responded, he picked up a stone from the ground, and the seventh immediately emerged from the bushes, raising his hands and begging him to wait. Bigan said with a cold smile that there was a reason he pretended to fall for their bait and walked away. He asked if the guy really thought he wouldn't notice the surveillance if he left only one person watching him. The guy sighed heavily and said with annoyance that the plan had failed. Bigan threw him a rolled-up piece of paper, explaining that it was a map with a precise description of the desired location and detailed information that would be useful when he got there. He warned that at first glance, it was just a cave hidden behind a rock. But once the seventh was inside, he would need to draw symbols from the second page of the document on the walls. He added that the seventh would not understand their meaning, but understanding was not necessary. The main thing was to complete the work before dawn. The seventh raised his hand and said indignantly that Bigan was talking as if he expected him to go there right now and complete the entire task. Bigan confirmed his guess with a slight smile. The seventh indignantly asked why he had to do it. But when he met Bigan's cold gaze and sensed the threat in his voice, he fell silent. Then, gritting his teeth, he turned and ran away, shouting curses as he ran. Bigan shouted after him to finish the job before morning. He understood that it would be difficult to completely mark out such a large area in one night. But even partially completed work will ensure that the symbols are visible to everyone who passes by. After that, everything will be completely under his control. In the evening, Semyon inquired about the progress of the investigation. Heavenly Maiden, who takes souls. Solon, with obvious displeasure in her voice, ordered him to call her by her name and not use a nickname that only provoked laughter and awkwardness. Semyon immediately apologized. He asked if she had managed to find out anything about the place Bigan had mentioned. Solon was lost in her own thoughts, reflecting on the fact that such power was not a blessing, and even she herself would not want to possess such a gift. She replied that she could not report anything definite yet, and that she would need more time to avoid mistakes and obtain accurate information. Semyon asked her to treat this investigation with the utmost care, noting that Bigan's actions had recently seemed suspicious and inexplicable. He said that if it turned out that he was a spy sent by a dangerous group, it would pose a serious threat to the entire Orthodox alliance. Solon calmly replied that it did not matter to her whether he was a follower of the alliance or the demon cult. But for the sake of the operation going smoothly, she would check a few details. Semyon asked in surprise what exactly she was going to check. At that moment, Solon abruptly plunged her blade into the wooden table. She coldly stated that if it turned out that Bigan had a dark past or hidden motives, she would not object to cutting his throat. Her eyes flashed with icy determination, and a thought flashed through her mind that it didn't matter if it all turned out to be a lie or a trap. If Bigan really dared to deceive her with such petty schemes, she would wring every confession out of him, and his death would be painful and long. The next morning, Bigan sat in the lotus position to focus on controlling and feeling the flow of mana running through his body. He focused on the middle energy core, where mana regeneration took place, and felt that it had become significantly stronger thanks to the high-quality mana stone he had absorbed earlier. Despite the progress he had made, Bigan admitted with slight disappointment that his power level was still limited to that of a sixth-circle mage. He noted that he was already capable of fighting one or two masters of the highest rank, and there was almost no one at the academy who could pose a threat to him, except for one person who stood apart from the rest. Bigan exhaled and focused on the tiny lower core, clearly feeling the internal energy. There were no problems with the vessels, meridians, or practice. His rare cursed constitution remained a mystery even to Master Jinbek, known for his impeccable reputation and profound knowledge. However, Bigan reflected, It was this very feature of his body that had allowed him to survive in the past and find himself in this place. He remembered the days when he knew only the simplest techniques and barely understood martial arts. But he was not killed. Instead, he was turned into a subject of cruel experiments because of his rare constitution. Begin's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the seventh, who had returned from his night mission. He asked discontentedly what Begin was doing, whether he was cultivating his energy or doing something similar. The guy sighed wearily and complained that he had spent the whole night on his feet, following his instructions and performing many strange and absurd actions. Begin opened his eyes and looked at him, asking what exactly he had asked him to do. The seventh exploded with a shout, indignantly declaring that Begin had lost his mind. Putting on his shirt, Begin calmly replied that he was only joking, praised the seventh for his work, and added that he could now leave and rest. When the seventh left, Begin took a deep breath and thought that now there was only one thing left to do. He got up, got fully dressed, and headed to the training hall to check on his students' progress. He calmly thought about his upcoming meeting with May Solon, to whom he was going to show the cave disguised as the hideout of the cult of the demonic spirit, and think of a plausible legend to convince her. He noted that the scene looked messy, but that didn't matter. The main trump card was the barrier set up by the demons, which the masters considered heretical witchcraft, accessible only to fanatics and occultists. The main thing was that Solon could not find reliable information about the cult of the demonic spirit, which made his plan an effective trap, even if she suspected something and had to follow the bait. Begin felt a powerful surge of mana and turned toward its source. His gaze met Solon's, and he greeted her. Solon replied that she intended to go to the very place he had mentioned earlier, which she believed was connected to the cult of the demonic spirit. Begin coldly decided to gradually feed Solon false information, fueling her thirst for revenge against the cult. He suggested meeting outside the academy that night to guide her to the cave. Begin's memories took him far back into the past, to the time when he was a prisoner of demons. The man's body writhed in pain. He screamed and choked on his own blood, unable to contain his agony. Begin furiously pounded his fists on the massive metal door, shouting that if they continued to mock him, he would die. In response to his cries, Solon, who was nearby, said in a quiet voice that he should stop, because it was already too late. Hearing her words, Begin lowered his hands, realizing the futility of resistance. After a while, the demons entered and, as if dragging a doll, took away the man's lifeless body. Solon watched silently, then said quietly that now only the two of them remained. She wondered if they were the last surviving martial arts masters. Begin slowly shook his head and said that it was too early to draw such conclusions, that perhaps there were still living masters somewhere in other camps. Solon sighed heavily and admitted that she hated this life full of pain and fear, and that it would be much easier for her to die on the battlefield than to endure such humiliation. A moment later, she asked if he wanted to hear something funny, and admitted that this was not the first time this had happened to her. Begin asked in surprise if this had happened to her while working in Jianghu. She said quietly that it was the cult of the demonic spirit, and added that there was no point in talking about it, because Begin would not be able to understand anyway. Begin, watching the flickering light, asked if it was an ability, an art of energy absorption, or a side effect of the experiments. Solon admitted that she was sharing this for the first time in many years. Begin nodded, noting that the ability had worked on the monsters, and admitted that he had not expected such a skill to emerge from the experiments. He cautiously asked if she had managed to get her revenge. Solon sighed deeply and quietly replied that, to be more precise, she had given up. In 10 years of searching, she had not been able to find a single trace of the cult of the demonic spirit. Ultimately, she realized that the organization was too large and beyond her reach. Then she asked if he knew why she had voluntarily joined the war. Begin replied that it was probably for her own future and for the survival of martial artists. Solon said that while the others were desperately fighting to protect Jianghu from monsters from another dimension, she was acting like a nobody, tired of life. She admitted that she was too cowardly to kill herself and joined the war to find death, but she did not expect to die slowly here. Begin, sensing the weight of her words, gently said that they should not give up and act as if everything was already over, because they were still alive. He added that no one would die here just because their spirit was broken, and that they had to grit their teeth and survive. Solon clenched her fists and said that if they managed to escape somehow, but Begin interrupted and said that there would be no ifs. They would do it and then track down the cult of the demonic spirit to take revenge, and he would help her. He asked if hope was kindling in her heart. Solon smiled, a slight irony flashing in her eyes, and said that he still saw her as weak, just a cripple who was unable to use her inner energy. Began took a deep breath, realizing that the memories he had long buried were beginning to resurface in his mind. He understood that this was because he had met her again after returning to the past. He was angry with himself and firmly decided that there was no time for meaningless emotions. The main thing now was to secure a strong position for Solon on the chessboard, because even if she herself was not yet aware of her abilities, they remained the key to victory. He decided not to waste time on apologies and requests for understanding. He had come too far to waste moments on such feelings. Meanwhile, Solon carefully examined the perimeter and realized that she had thoroughly checked everything around her, but found no traps or suspicious traces. She thought that perhaps someone had set something up in the place Begin had mentioned. A thought flashed through her mind that perhaps he himself had once been captured by representatives of the cult of the demonic spirit. Suddenly, she sensed someone approaching and said that he had arrived quite early. Solon slowly turned around and saw a man who immediately rushed to attack her, causing her to freeze in surprise. The girl ran along the snow-covered road, her little feet leaving tracks in the white snow. She sang happily that the snowflakes were cold, and her laughter was loud and joyful. Her father watched her with a smile and said that even in such weather, the girl liked to run in the snow. Her mother warned her to be careful not to hurt herself. Suddenly, the girl tripped over a rock and fell, sliding down the snow, and tears immediately glistened on her cheeks. Her mother knelt down beside her and comforted her, gently asking if she could get up. But Solon suddenly heard a nasty voice telling the bitch to wake up. In front of her was a man who radiated danger. He declared angrily that he would avenge his brother, whom she had killed. Solon realized that he was the leader of the outcast gang, known as Black Retribution. The gang he belonged to was notorious for robbery, murder, kidnapping, and slave trade. There were no boundaries for them. Solon, realizing the danger of the situation, thought that she would never have expected the gang leader and his deputy to be brothers. She had let her guard down, trusting her usual caution, and now her attention was distracted as soon as the words about the demonic spirit cult reached her ears. V. Sang Tak said that when he was told about his younger brother's pain, he first thought that Solon had seduced him with her looks. Now he was surprised that her martial arts skills were so perfect, which had caused a lot of bloodshed. Solon smiled coldly and retorted that he was too talkative, as if he wanted to have fun like his dead brother. Then she asked if that was why he had gone to such lengths to catch her. The man smiled maliciously, noting that she was smart, and that if he had wanted to kill her right away, he would have done so. If the rumors had been false, she would have been destroyed with a single blow of his sword. He grabbed her hair sharply, lifting her off the ground, and said that he never expected the heavenly maiden to be so beautiful, and that today he would enjoy heavenly pleasures. Taking out his sword, he said that first he would cut off both her hands, with which, according to rumors, she drew out internal energy. And after all his subordinates were satisfied, he intended to kill her, carefully cutting every piece of her beautiful skin from her bones. He said that wasn't he at least obliged to do this so that his younger brother could rest peacefully in his grave? Solon noted that such a method was too dirty to be called revenge. She thought she sincerely believed that she had finally found the most important clue that would lead her to those bastards hiding in the shadows. But was she now destined to meet her death at the hands of these savage creatures, for whom human life meant nothing? She reasoned that perhaps for a mercenary blinded by the thirst for revenge, such an end was quite fitting. The crowd shouted that the boss should cut off her hands and start the fun, that it was time for everyone to have a good time. But suddenly the atmosphere in the room changed. Begin appeared out of nowhere. All his clothes were smeared with blood. Powerful mana flowed heavily around his body. Solon looked up in shock, her lips breaking into a whisper as she barely audibly uttered the instructor's name. She called out to him, but when she saw his face, she immediately fell silent, her heart filled with fear. The man jumped out of the shadows and, swinging a heavy hammer, yelled furiously, demanding to know who he was. But Began caught the movement behind him before the blow reached its target. His body lunged forward, and he used the rush technique. A moment later, he was behind his enemy, grabbed him by the neck, and lifted him into the air. He said furiously that they should understand that their actions had nearly ruined the plan he had been building in his head for centuries. In the next second, Begin activated the lightning strike technique, and the enemy's body was illuminated by flashes of blue light. Lightning wrapped around his flesh, causing unbearable torment, every cell in his body burning with pain, and in a matter of moments, there was nothing left of the enemy. One of the thugs asked in bewilderment what that was. Was it really lightning? San barked at his men, calling them idiots and ordering them to stop standing there like statues. The crowd rushed into the attack. Bigan contemptuously threw the dead body aside and instantly activated the blick technique. His figure seemed to dissolve into thin air. One of the men panicked and shouted, asking where he had gone. Bigan was already behind him and, using airshot, tore the attacker to pieces. His movements became elusive. He moved so fast that his enemies didn't even have time to turn around. Each of his steps brought death. Each swing was precise and merciless. Bigan raised his sword and, filling it with his mana, strengthened the blade to the level of a deadly weapon. Those who had been trying to attack a second ago now realized with horror that they were facing a force they could not resist. They began to retreat. Someone screamed, and panic swept away the remnants of their fighting spirit. But they did not have time to escape. Bigan was faster than any of them. His blade left a trail of blood behind him, and only cries for mercy could be heard in the air. Solon, watching this brutal slaughter, felt her heart freeze. She couldn't believe what was happening. A question flashed through her mind. Was this really the same man she had met just 2 days ago? She noticed the movement and, realizing that one of the enemies had crept up behind Bigan, shouted loudly for him to be careful. However, the enemy managed to close the distance and, swinging his sword, told him to die. His sword struck Bigan's body, but instead of wounding him, it only damaged the surface of the sword. Bigan activated the stone skin technique, and his body was protected by an impenetrable barrier. The man, not believing his eyes, shouted in horror, asking if it was really a protective barrier of enhanced chi energy. Bigan's fist struck his face with such force that he flew halfway across the room and crashed to the floor. Bigan stepped forward, raised his leg, and activated the gravity press technique. His eyes burned with rage as he told the damn parasite to die. The devastating blow shook the ground beneath their feet and left a deep crater in the floor. Solon, breathing heavily, freed herself from the tight ropes and grabbed her sword, pointing the tip directly at Bigan. Solon, struggling to keep the tremor in her voice under control, asked who the hell he really was. Bigan's expression changed instantly, and he said how happy he was that she was safe and sound. He admitted that he had been so upset when he couldn't find her at the meeting place that he immediately went looking for her. The man added with a forced smile that his tracking skills were indeed quite good. But Solon did not buy his words. She stood opposite him, holding her blade as firmly as before. Bigan sighed in disappointment, his gaze darkening. Inside, he irritably acknowledged his own mistake. He mentally noted that at this rate, his original plan, which was to control her with the information he had gathered before the regression, would now fail. He couldn't believe that someone dared to attack May Solon at this crucial moment. He pondered what to do now. He was well aware that he could not abandon her under any circumstances. The reason was obvious. May Solon was a key element in the upcoming battle with the Demon King, an element that could not be replaced. The Demon King Taram possessed a nullifying barrier capable of turning any attack into nothingness, which impressed even Bigan. He understood that the barrier was impossible to destroy and that all preparation was pointless. According to his information, only May Solon could remove the protection. Her ability to absorb the enemy's internal energy through direct contact already made her unique. Bigan was sure that Solon herself knew only about this aspect of her powers. However, the true essence of her gift lay elsewhere. She could erase and destroy any concept, the very essence of another's energy. In order to reach the level where her abilities could overcome Tarrant's barrier, Solon needed to strengthen her skills as quickly as possible. Since the information leak had already occurred, he had to subdue her right now and then force her to act according to his plan. Solon tensed when she noticed him slightly raising his sword. She threatened him not to come any closer. She added coldly that if he moved a finger, she would kill him without hesitation. Bigan froze, and a scene from that terrible future flashed into his memory when Solon desperately called his name, begging him to open his eyes and answer her. He remembered his own body, broken and in incredible pain. Meanwhile, the monsters watched his torment, expressing surprise that he was still alive, even though the pain he was experiencing could tear his body to pieces. One said that his death was only a matter of time, because humans were incapable of wielding magic at such a level. The second added indifferently that they didn't care if he survived, because they had already collected all the data on his mutation. However, they came to the conclusion that if he survived, he could become a threat, and it would be better to get rid of him. Solon, watching his suffering, thought that all the energy they were pouring into his body was only causing a backlash and destructive rejection. Anger flared in her chest at the thought that these monsters had really decided to kill him. Began, barely moving his lips, begged her to kill him. He admitted that he had reached his limit and could no longer endure all this pain. Solon exploded with rage. She screamed at him to stop talking nonsense, calling him stubborn and cursing his desire to give up. She reminded him that he had given her his word that they would survive and take revenge on these creatures together. Began was losing his last strength, and Solon thought that this couldn't be happening because his consciousness was fading and his body was deteriorating faster and faster. All their shared moments flashed through her mind, every glance and every battle. Her heart was pierced with pain, and she silently asked him for forgiveness. Some time passed before Began regained consciousness. He opened his eyes and found that his body had been completely restored. He wondered what had happened, because the streams of different energies that had been raging inside him seemed to have been completely washed away. Solon said with a tired smile that she was glad to see that he seemed to be all right. Began turned his head to ask how this was possible, but froze when he saw her body. She confessed in a quiet voice that, to be honest, she wasn't sure she could do it. He tried to approach her, but his strength left him, and he collapsed to his knees. Solon gently told him not to waste his strength and just sit quietly. She reminded him that just a few seconds ago, he had been 1 foot in the grave. Ever since she discovered that her powers worked on these monsters, she realized that she could absorb more energy than she had previously thought. She smiled and admitted that she had somehow managed to absorb all that power, but the energy was too foreign, so she couldn't get rid of it. Perhaps things would have turned out differently if she had discovered this ability a little earlier. Began desperately declared that she was a crazy woman and that now was not the time for chatter, because she was dying in his place. His voice broke into a cry as he asked her why she had done it. Solon smiled weakly and quietly reminded him that he himself had said that they should not give up. Shouldn't he be held accountable for his own words? Through his tears, Began croaked that she was a foolish woman, because he had only said that so she would continue living. Solon looked him in the eyes and said that he had to go on living and at least occasionally remember this foolish woman. In his memories, everything before Began's eyes plunged into darkness, and then he seemed to return to the present. The next second, his fingers relaxed, and the sword fell to the ground with a dull thud. He slowly looked up at Solon and said in an even voice that she should calm down, because there was no longer any threat to her. Solon did not lower her blade and asked suspiciously if he thought she would believe his words. She demanded an explanation of how he knew she was being held here. And those strange martial arts he had used earlier could hardly be called ordinary techniques. Solon added sharply that everything he had said about the demonic cult from the very beginning was a lie. Her voice became stern and firm as she demanded an answer to the main question. What was his true identity? Began took a deep breath and said that even if he answered that question now, she still wouldn't believe a word he said. So instead, he would tell her what he could do for her. Solon narrowed her eyes and asked coldly what exactly he meant. Began said that first he would help her take revenge on the demonic cult. Second, he would make her martial arts and energy absorption abilities stronger than they were now. Third, he would take full responsibility for her life and protect her from all threats that came her way, just as he had just saved her. He reached out his hand to her and said that in exchange for all this, he asked for only one thing. Let her stay with him, let her be close to him, and nothing else. Solon exclaimed with obvious distrust, how could he say such nonsense? She pressed her lips together and asked suspiciously if he was going to make her his concubine. Began calmly but firmly replied that she was mistaken and that he meant exactly what he said. No more, no less. The man explained that it would be more difficult for him to act if she were in danger and suddenly died, as had almost happened this time. Solon said that he was talking nonsense just to distract her after revealing the truth. She furiously accused him of wanting to tame and subjugate her. Squinting, she added that he'd better disappear because he was a pervert and she would rather die than let him get his way. Began asked if she was really so sure of her words. He asked if she would be at peace even after taking such a step, adding that her parents would be very sad if she died. He pronounced that name Lanlin with particular warmth, as if recalling the past. A memory came to her mind of when she was just a baby. Then her mother, holding the baby in her arms, asked the old man anxiously what was happening to their daughter. The old man shook his head and said that she had no physical ailments, but unfortunately her fate was extremely difficult and full of dangers. Her mother was outraged by his words and exclaimed that he was saying something strange and frightening. Then the old man gently asked if they had already named their daughter. The father replied that they had not yet decided on a name. The old man said that they should name the girl Solon, which means winter orchid. He explained that names have great power, and this name would help the girl survive even in severe frosts. When Solon grew up a little, she indignantly told her parents that they had been foolish to believe in such predictions. Her father replied that they had never believed in these fairy tales and were simply very worried about her and could not have done otherwise. Her mother added that this was precisely why, after leaving the old man, they decided to give her another name. Even though her real name had already been chosen, they wanted their daughter to feel the warmth of family in her early years. That is why they began to call her Lanlin, which means shining orchid. Her mother said that until the harsh winters of fate arrived, they hoped she would be like a flower that warmed them with its rays. The girl firmly told her mother not to say such things because she and her father had nothing to worry about. She swore that no matter what happened, Lanlin would cope with all the difficulties herself. But time was relentless. Their village was burned to the ground, and her parents died, leaving her alone. When a man from a demonic cult approached her, he noted with interest that this was the very girl endowed with a rare nature. He uttered her name and said that she was destined to live and die like a weed. But now she had been given the honor of being part of a great plan and helping to resurrect something grand. In the present, Solon, gripping the hilt of her sword and bringing the blade closer to Begin's face, demanded answers. She demanded to know who he was and how he knew her name, which was known only to members of her family. Begin pushed the blade away slightly and replied with cold certainty that she would not believe his words even if he told her the truth. He said that in the current situation, he had told her everything he could and now the choice was hers. In conclusion, he emphasized that his promises were not empty words and hoped that she would think carefully before making her decision. After that, he calmly left, leaving Solon alone with her thoughts and doubts. Meanwhile, Seven had been waiting patiently for Begon in his room for a long time. When he returned, the seventh jumped up to him indignantly and asked where he had been wandering in the middle of the night. He demanded an explanation for the work he had been assigned, saying that he had wasted a lot of time and run around like an idiot for a task he had been given the day before yesterday. But when he met Begon's stern gaze, Seventh instantly backed down. He muttered that he could see how tired he was and that they would talk later. After these words, he hurriedly ran away. Begon collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, and the thought flashed through his mind that everything had gone completely wrong. The next day, he again watched the students work closely, giving advice and correcting mistakes where necessary. He thought that Solon would surely just leave. Even if she wanted to take revenge on the demonic cult, she would never trust him because he was too suspicious and dangerous. He understood that in her place, he would have done the same and conducted his own investigation alone. Began mentally cursed himself, calling himself an idiot who was ready to ruin the whole plan because of events that happened 200 years ago. He decided that it was not too late, that he should go after her and do everything he could to change the situation. At that moment, Somo, noticing the inspector behind Begon, greeted her warmly. Solon smiled and said that his name seemed to be So-So, adding a wish for a good morning. The girl politely greeted Instructor Sa, apologized for distracting him during class, and politely asked if he could spare her a little time. Begon immediately agreed and gestured to his students to focus on their training. Solon approached him and suggested they switch to a more informal conversation, asking him to extend his hand. Began silently held out his palm, allowing her to touch it, and watched her actions. Solon frowned and said that there were no traces of internal energy in his vessels, and coldly acknowledged that he really couldn't use it. Begon asked if she believed him now. Solon pulled her hand away and said that his words were ridiculous. She added that after all his lies, it was foolish to expect trust, reminding him that from their first meeting, everything had been a deception, his innate abilities and the story about his abduction by a cult. Begon calmly admitted that this was true and wanted her to investigate him specifically. Solon irritably called him an idiot and declared that he had only gotten close to her for his own purposes. She wanted to know who he really was, what his true goals were, and how he had learned about her past. Solon said she wanted to get all the answers out of him right now, but she understood that he was not the type to reveal his secret so easily, so she decided to let him deceive her one last time. Began admitted that he thought she would just leave. Solon said that was exactly what she should have done, because it was impossible to believe the words of such a liar. She said she didn't care about anything else, but he had to keep one promise. He had to take revenge on the demonic cult, no matter what it took. If that turns out to be a lie, she added, then she will kill him with her own hands. Began laughed and replied that he swore to fulfill this promise and would definitely take revenge on the cult, as she wished. Solon looked at him intently and said that one phrase bothered her. How did he know her childhood nickname, a secret unknown even to the demonic cult? A picture from the past flashed through his mind. Solon whispered as she disappeared that she had one last request. A faint smile touched her lips as she confessed that her parents had given her a second name when she was very young. It had been a happy time, short and bright, but now so distant. She laughed softly, reminding him that Lanlin meant shining orchid, and asked if that name wasn't perfect for her current state. She asked that he remember her only as a beautiful memory, and that all the scenes that brought sadness and suffering be erased. The memories disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Biggin smiled and said quietly that he had already told her she would never believe him. Nin Soso looked up when she introduced herself. Noting that she was a freshman at the Dragon Spring Academy, she confessed that she was now facing the greatest challenge of her life, a crisis that affected not only her, but the fate of their entire class. The girl told Soso to stop hesitating and start answering directly. Another added that if she decided to lie, the consequences would be serious, and that it was better to tell the truth. The leader of the group said that Soso should tell everything without hiding anything. If for any reason their class committed actions that could tarnish the academy's name, she was obliged to take action, even if it meant reporting the incident to the family elders. So thought that the girl was a freshman like her, only she studied in the Flying Dragon class. She was known as the Golden Jade Leaf, a representative of the noble Mach family, one of the most famous families among the Orthodox. So had heard that the academy received annual support from the Mach family, and if the girl said anything bad about the class, the consequences could be disastrous. Half the class could disappear. She mentally turned to Began, telling him not to worry, because she would prove the class's ability and protect her classmates from any interference from the noble Mach family. She began to tell how she spent hours in the training hall, perfecting her movements and practicing each turn until it became automatic. Solon watched her and finally said with a slight smile that her movements had become noticeably smoother than before, but there was still too much force going into the turns, and she advised her to avoid sudden transitions. This was Inspector May Solon, who had been at the academy for about 2 weeks. At first, Soso was a little nervous about her presence, as there were rumors that Solon kept a close eye on the class. But after spending time with her, she was relieved to see that she was a kind and gentle person. Suddenly, Began's loud voice interrupted everyone's thoughts. He announced a general assembly and said he had an important announcement to make. Unrolling a scroll, he solemnly announced that from that day on, the class would have an official name. One of the students asked in surprise about the meaning of the name Special Purpose Class. Biggin calmly explained that it reflected the class's goal, which was unattainable for the other students at the academy. Tan did not hide his curiosity and asked what the purpose of the class was. Began explained that the main mission was to protect the martial arts world of the Central Plains. This man is their class teacher, Sa Began, an instructor who, despite his eccentricities, is still a remarkable master. Although he was initially known for his complete inability to use internal energy, a month ago he surprised everyone by demonstrating incredible key skills at a public event. He then successfully passed the promotion exam and became the instructor responsible for their class. Solon, who was watching the scene, asked with a slight sneer if Began was going to make the students train hard for some childish fun. Began replied that this was a serious task to protect the martial arts world of the Central Plains, and it was not a game at all. Solon narrowed her eyes and asked if he had permission to use that name for the class. Began smiled and suggested that they get permission together, and she reluctantly agreed to accompany him. Initially, they addressed each other formally, but over time, minor arguments became more frequent. Solon felt that the invisible wall between them had collapsed, creating tension and an unusual bond that gradually brought them closer together. The girl interrupted the story and said that enough was enough with the unnecessary conversation. She didn't think it was necessary to waste time on the love story of two instructors. So, without losing her composure, replied that she had been told to tell absolutely everything. Then who did they want to hear about? Manhwa, with obvious impatience, said that he didn't care about the others, but he wanted to know how things were going with Yeon Wookyeon. So paused for a moment, wondering why the attention was focused on only one person. She began her story, explaining that at first Yeon Wookyeon refused to transfer to their class, just like Danhwa. But, as everyone knows, after an argument with the instructor, he decided to stay. Still, in her opinion, there was nothing special to say about Wookyeon. So noted that he had not undergone any of the basic training that the others had undergone. Upon hearing this, Danhwa furiously asked if the instructor was neglecting Wookyeon. She said that she had seen him fight with instructor Sa Bigan several times. As far as she knew, Wookyeon was the only one in the class who dared to cross swords with the master. So added that she spent most of her time standing motionless in front of the scarecrow, because the instructor had even warned them not to interfere with the training. Danhwa asked if that meant Wookyeon was completely satisfied with his situation. So shook her head, admitting that she didn't know for sure, but it seemed to her that he had no complaints. Hearing this, the girl blushed and quietly promised that they would see each other again next time. When they left, So breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that her mission to protect the special class was complete. Later, she learned that Mok Danhwa and Yeon Wookyeon had been engaged since early childhood, and all problems could be considered solved. In the evening, a ghostly shadow moved cautiously across the rooftops, trying to remain unnoticed. But suddenly she heard the familiar voice of Biga behind her, saying that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. The first, slightly surprised, noted that this was impressive, because he had used the strongest concealment technique. But Bigan calmly reminded him that his famous techniques did not work here. He asked if the fact that he had come in person meant that the task entrusted to him had been completed. The first one deftly threw a small glass jar into Bigan's hand. When he looked inside the vessel, he froze, and his gaze reflected recognition that the creature before him could not be confused with anything else. The first one said that the find was related to the second part of Bigan's task. The location was unknown, but it was likely a remote area of Hubei or Chongqing province with a sparse population and a heavily altered, bizarre environment. Finding such a place was a key objective that matched Bigan's request. He admitted that he had expected a long search, given the enormous area to be investigated, but to his own surprise, he managed it much faster. This was because what he saw was impossible to miss. It was a sight that burned itself into the memory of anyone who saw it even once. After that, the first asked for an explanation of what kind of place it was, since even he could not fully understand its nature. Bigan said that in any case, the first would not believe him, even if he explained everything in words. Without hesitation, he crushed the creature in the jar. Drops of murky liquid ran down his hand, and he said grimly that it was easiest to call it a sign of catastrophe. The invasion of the demon race into this world was supposed to happen in 10 years. Now he clearly realized that the signs of this catastrophe had begun to appear long before it began. 4 or 5 years before the invasion, strange plants and animals that had never been seen there before appeared in the Central Plains. 2 years before the invasion, mutated beasts began attacking humans. And 6 months before the catastrophe, humanity was faced with mysterious and inexplicable diseases that spread at an alarming rate. All this was the work of demons who used highly concentrated forms of mana, scattering them across the plains and altering the nature of the earth itself, turning future battlefields into an environment convenient for themselves. This strategy was called terraforming, and he learned about it later, already as a prisoner of the demonic army. The question he asked himself over and over again was forever etched in his memory. What happened in those places where the giant interdimensional gates first opened in the Central Plains? Then during the invasion itself, an entire city was wiped off the face of the earth in a single day, and shortly thereafter, the largest gate known to mankind was discovered in Hubei province. He gathered all the known facts and came to the conclusion that the terraforming process might already have been launched. At the time, it was only a hypothesis, but now he had direct evidence in his hands. With these thoughts in mind, Bigan performed a cleansing ritual, removed the traces of blood from the creature he had just destroyed, and said that the job had been done perfectly. He added that he would pass on the information in a few days through his subordinate, as he needed time to systematize the data, and the first would have to wait. The first asked a direct question about his true nature. He said that Began was clearly hiding something and knew much more than he was saying. Began sighed deeply and said that he had already said that if he told the truth now, the first would not believe him anyway. There was no need to rush. When the right moment came, he would tell the whole truth, even if his interlocutor begged him to remain silent, and so he could only wait for that day to come. After these words, Began thought that perhaps it was time to start preparing to leave this cursed academy. The next day, there was a conversation between two instructors at the academy. Semin asked how the selection of students for the Heavenly Battle Tournament was going. Dong replied that the selection was going according to plan, with Lee Bigum and Mok Danhwa selected from the Flying Dragon class, after which he moved on to discussing the Camellia class. However, someone interrupted him, asking if Yeon Wookyoung was still refusing to participate in the tournament. Dong sighed and said that a few days ago he had tried again to persuade the student, but he firmly stated that participation would only interfere with his own path of learning. Dong noted that it was not worth dwelling on this issue, because although Lee Bigum was inferior to Yeon Wookyoung in talent, he still had great potential. Semin agreed, but emphasized that the selection process should be as strict as possible, because the tournament is the Academy's most important event in the outside world. The event was organized by the Ort Alliance, in which three great academies participated: the White Military Academy, the Heavenly Academy, and the Dragon Spring Academy. The best students gathered there to test their skills and compete with each other. The results of these battles directly affected the reputation of the academies in the eyes of the outside world. Dong reminded everyone that the Demon Sword had the right to approve the participants, and Simun assured them with a smile that there was no need to worry. He noted that the Demon Sword had not appeared at the academy for 2 years, spending all his time in the training hall, and had effectively allowed it to operate without his participation. The conversation was interrupted when the office door burst open with a bang. Began entered, pushing it open with his foot, and said he apologized for his intrusion. Then, glancing at those gathered, he added with liveliness in his voice that he was glad to see the very people he was looking for. Dong flushed with indignation and said sharply that such rudeness was unacceptable. But Began ignored his words and greeted them with a smile, saying that as a senior instructor, he had an extremely important message that could not be delayed. Began said that he and his students intended to participate in the upcoming Heavenly Battle Tournament. Upon hearing these words, Semin exploded with indignation, exclaiming that this was complete nonsense, and then asked if he really thought anyone would allow him to do such a thing. Began calmly asked why not. He said that victory would solve all the Academy's problems. Simun couldn't take it anymore, and shouted that he should stop this dangerous nonsense, reminding him that the Heavenly Tournament was a large-scale event involving high-ranking masters from the Ordinary Alliance. He stated that it was impossible to send someone as incompetent as Began there. Began said that he found it interesting to hear such an opinion. He then reminded him that it was instructor Dong Bu-hyun who was originally appointed to select the participants, and asked if he wholeheartedly believed that he was suitable for the role. Dong frowned and exclaimed in confusion, asking what he meant. Began, not letting him finish, coldly said that he had neither real skills nor the necessary awareness. All Dong had was a pathetic sense of self-worth and an age that made him more like a fossil than a mentor. For the sake of the younger generation, he should step aside and give his place to others. Dong flushed with rage, his voice trembling with anger, and he barked at Began to repeat his words. Semin said that instructor Dun should control himself, but Dun asked if he was suggesting that he should tolerate such humiliation. Semin irritably reminded him that he should not allow such an upstart to provoke him. Began said that all this time he had believed that the value of a martial artist was determined by his skill, not by loud words, but now he saw that some preferred to look for excuses for their own weakness. Dong couldn't take it anymore, and angrily shouted at Began to shut up immediately, go outside, and give him a chance to smash his face in. At that moment, Began allowed himself an internal smirk and thought that this was exactly the response he wanted to hear. If he publicly defeated Dong, Simun would be disgraced, which meant that after a little pressure, he would be able to take on the role of supervisor of the Heavenly Martial Arts Tournament. He mentally noted that the tournament would be held at the White Martial Arts Academy, located in the Shanxi province. It would take about a month to get there from the Dragon Spring Academy in Jiangxi, but if they deviated slightly from the route, they would be able to pass through the very place where the first had discovered the demonic zone. Of course, if it were just a matter of verifying the facts, he could get there much faster on his own, but that wasn't his only goal. If John Simyong continues to obstruct him even after defeating Dong Bu-hyun, then he will be able to provide evidence of all the corruption Simyong was involved in. Suddenly, Biga felt a strong pressure of mana, as if a heavy cloud was hanging over him. Dong shouted furiously that they were taking too long and that he was accepting Sabigan's challenge. Bigan turned toward the door, his gaze focused, his technique ready for use, waiting. Bigan concentrated and used his search technique, his eyes enveloped in flickering mana. At that moment, a man entered the hall and said that he hadn't been here in a long time and ended up witnessing a rather amusing conversation. He approached Bigan and said that he had heard the words that the value of a martial arts master is determined by his skills. Then he smiled and said loudly that it was true. A true martial arts master must have strength of spirit. He declared that the young man was exactly as rumored and that he liked him. Simoon and Dong froze simultaneously, unable to believe their eyes, and exclaimed the name of the visitor. It was the senior sword technique instructor at the Dragon Spring Academy, known as the Dark Shadow of the Divine Sword, San Pilji. He said he hadn't seen them in a long time and asked how they were doing. Semin, unable to hide his tension, asked why he had come. Kuch just asked mockingly what kind of strange question that was. And was there really a place in the academy where he couldn't come? Semyon quickly replied that, of course, there wasn't. Kok laughed and told everyone to relax, that he was joking, and there was no need to look at him with such frightened eyes. Bigan watched him silently, thinking that, in the end, this man was not interested in teaching others at all, but was obsessed with perfecting his own skills, and was the most sincere fanatic of martial arts. But among all the martial arts masters he had met since his regression, this man was the strongest. Ko, frowning slightly, replied that he had just gone out for some fresh air and then decided to check how true the rumors circulating around the academy were. He admitted that he had heard discussions about Bigan and his students participating in the Heavenly Martial Arts Tournament. Semyon became visibly nervous. Then, pointing to Bigan, he said that this young man had suddenly appeared at the door and begun to make demands. Koak asked with interest whether Bigan was going to represent the academy at the Heavenly Tournament. Bigan confirmed this and added that he wanted to personally select the students to participate. Hawk laughed and said that he appreciated the young man's courage, adding that it was bold, almost provocative. Then he asked if that meant that Bigan's students were stronger than the academy's best students. Bigan looked at him with cold anger in his eyes and said that this was indeed the case. Khan reminded him that it had only been about a month since Bigan became a senior instructor and pointed out that insisting on participating in an official event of such magnitude as a tournament was too risky. Dong, not hiding his agreement, picked up on his words and said that he completely agreed. Khan reminded him that he had said that a master's true qualification is determined by his fighting skills, and that it is these skills that determine the master's weight in authority. Then he clapped his hands and proposed holding a public martial arts competition to determine the academy's representative. Those who were originally selected to participate in the tournament would have to fight the cadets proposed by Bigan to determine the strongest. With a smile, Khan added that this was a reasonable proposal if Bigan was confident that he was ready to put his students forward as representatives of the academy. Khan then clarified whether Bigan's words meant that these students were truly outstanding talents and whether he was prepared to prove it in practice.